A piercing scream echoed across the battlefield, calling out to the lady named Arin, who, exhausted and badly wounded, could barely stand on her feet. Before her on the ground lay the fallen dragon, its huge body no longer moving, swallowed up in the silence of death. The mages and other members of the squad surrounded the fragile warrior in the blink of an eye, who, having lost her strength, took on her human form. Her breathing was intermittent, the wounds were deep, and her vision was beginning to fade, and without support, she would have already collapsed onto the cold ground. A charming girl with thick chestnut hair, looking tiredly and absent-mindedly into the distance, as if through a fog, whispered in a weakening voice that the pain had taken over her entire body, penetrating every cell, and her strength was leaving her faster than she would like. Their mission was to destroy a fierce, merciless dragon that knew no mercy, destroyed cities, burned villages, and brought chaos, threatening the entire world order. And now that the battle was over, their hearts were filled with fatigue, pain, and bitterness of loss. Among the members of their squad was Chania, a dazzling beauty with shining blonde hair, and now she, trembling with helplessness, bent over her friend, whom cruel fate had made a victim of this mad battle, and her tears flowed down her cheeks. Stood nearby a young warrior with thick purple hair, his gaze burning with hatred fixed on the fallen dragon, his hands clenched into fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Zephyr, an elf with dazzling white hair and long, graceful ears, was arguing irritably with a red-haired warrior named Gidor, because he, bending over a wounded girl, was saying absurd, despairing words, and Zephyr, unable to bear it, exclaimed, drenched in the blood of a dead monster, their leader, the dark-haired handsome Elkinas, stood in a daze, not believing his eyes, and despite the fact that his body was covered in wounds, the most severe pain pierced his heart, because his faithful friend was dying before his eyes. It was he who took on the role of leader of their squad, led them on the hunt, and confidently directed every movement, directing the fighters with the precision of an experienced strategist whose instinct and determination left no room for error or delay. The dragon's bright yellow eyes, glittering with aggression, sparkled in the semi-darkness, filled with a wild, unbridled rage with which he was ready to destroy anyone who dared to stand in his way, without a drop of regret or the slightest shadow of doubt. At the very moment when the monster was about to spew out a searing flame, Arin, without wasting a second, rushed forward, blocking the path of the destructive attack, ready to sacrifice herself for the sake of her friends, for their lives and salvation. Without a moment's hesitation, she abruptly pushed her commander aside, shielding him from the inevitable blow, realizing that this was the only way she could prevent disaster and save those who were dear to her. Feeling a surge of power, she grabbed the crimson sphere that shimmered like a hot coal, and without hesitation, she absorbed it, allowing the energy to spread within, creating a barrier that became the last defense for everyone standing behind her. Since this technique was truly deadly, the exhausted beauty collapsed to the ground, realizing that she had become both a hero and a victim, because without a moment's hesitation, she gave her life to protect those dear to her. The lady, barely audible in her breath, asked quietly if the dragon was dead, but her voice trembled, as if she was afraid to hear an answer that might destroy the hope that their fight had not been in vain. Jamil, squeezing her hand tightly, almost shouted at her, breaking into furious reproaches. But behind this rudeness there was pain, because he could not come to terms with the fact that she was so stupidly, so carelessly sacrificing herself, without thinking about those who would be left without her. The young man could no longer hold back his tears. His chest was squeezed by a heavy weight, and, forgetting about pride, he began to cry. Because just recently they had made an oath to each other that their team would always be together, that nothing could separate them. Erin smiled weakly and barely audibly asked her friend not to cry. But the poison was already creeping up on her eyes, and the world around her began to blur, turning into blurry shadows, losing clarity, losing color, like a melting dream. Elkinas suddenly, silently, without turning around, began to walk away somewhere into the depths of the darkness. His steps were drowned in the silence, and soon only his back remained visible, moving away into the unknown, like a wanderer walking into the night, for whom there is no way back. The lady laughed sadly, realizing that her own death was inevitable, but instead of fear, there was peace in her voice, and, accepting her fate, she only asked the team to live their lives with dignity, not to waste them in vain, because trials awaited them ahead. Like an hourglass, in which the scarlet sand was flowing, marking the last moments of her existence, time was inexorably drawing to an end, and no force could turn it back. And so, resigned to the inevitable, she allowed herself to disappear into eternity. Erin suddenly screamed, feeling herself rapidly falling into the void, not understanding where exactly she was being carried, and her body, having become weightless, seemed to have lost touch with reality, and only a light white dress swayed in the night wind. The face of their captain suddenly appeared before her, gloomy, frightening, with dark eyes in which there were no pupils, only a bottomless, cold emptiness, from looking into which an icy horror ran across the skin. And at that moment, it seemed to her that she was seeing not a person, but an insect. Aaron, consumed by the memories of the last moments of her life, could not understand why she could still feel the air entering her lungs, when she should have died, as everyone thought, the moment her life came to an end. However, instead of finding herself in the world of the dead, she found herself in a green meadow surrounded by mysterious flowers and grass, with no idea where exactly she was, as if all reality had been distorted around her. Reaching out her hand, Aaron suddenly felt an unimaginable amount of spirit energy around her, as if invisible forces were beginning to surround her, and a strange, mysterious feeling of something greater and more powerful hung in the air. Finally realizing that her location was the place near the World Tree, she experienced a real shock reaction, her voice filled with surprise when the stranger approached and, without saying a word, stood next to her, as if waiting for her reaction. It was Zephyr, the Dragon Lord, an elf with special ears and hair as white as snow, a man whose appearance could enchant anyone. His appearance, like his gaze, was irresistible, attracting admiring glances. The young man, smiling, with a slight nostalgia in his voice, greeted the sorceress, whom he had not met for many years, as if not a day had passed, as if an old friend had returned from a long absence, forgetting about all the vicissitudes of time. For the girl, these words came as a real shock. After all, almost 80 years had passed since she was killed, and the world around her had changed beyond recognition, leaving her, like many others, trapped in the past, forgotten by time. Zephyr, noticing her stunned expression, smiled and chuckled, thinking that his experiment seemed to have really worked, a combination of magic and science that allowed him to change the very course of time, bringing a new order to the world. The lady, still shaken by what had happened, followed her old friend with restraint, carefully observing how the world had changed during her absence, trying to understand how everything around her had become different from what she remembered. Zephyr paused for a moment as he heard his friend ask him what had happened, worriedly, and begging him to explain what had happened, as if trying to understand what exactly had caused this unusual situation. As if nothing special had happened, the elf confidently and calmly began to tell, while putting his mug on the table, that after the death of that stunning beauty, he decided to hide her soul, hiding all this from the others. The woman's soul was so filled with happiness at the moment of death that, as if by magic, a golden sphere appeared from it, shining with a bright light, symbolizing the purity and joy she experienced in her last moments. Calmly, with a slight note of sadness in his voice, Zephyr explained that it was this golden sphere that he took for himself and hid so that no one could find it, because it was extremely important that the secret remain hidden from everyone. Irritated, the lady clenched her fist and screamed loudly, claiming that the man had no right to treat her like that because she deserved respect and honor, and not such treatment that clearly humiliated her dignity. Zephyr, holding back a wave of emotions, calmly explained that his intentions were quite noble, and he just wanted to bury her with dignity, choosing a place next to the World Tree, which was guarded by powerful dragons ready to protect it from any threats. The lady was the only being deserving of such respect, since she was loved and protected by the spirits who bestowed their care upon her, and nature itself, sensing her uniqueness, could not help but respond to her presence in this world. The elf immediately drank the drink from his mug in one gulp, when suddenly he was asked a question by Aaron, who curiously asked how she was able to stay alive, despite everything that was happening around her. It turned out that when Zephyr came to bury the woman's soul in a golden sphere beneath the sacred tree, he had to pay a high price, shedding his own blood to complete this complex and magical ritual. But after that, as if by the will of unknown forces, a magical seal of a bright red color appeared, which began to glow, as if it was intended to indicate something important and mystical that was about to happen. And so, as if by a miraculous design of fate, the tree accepted the soul of the deceased lady, carefully hiding it in its branches, as if protecting and defending it from all troubles and misfortunes, granting it eternal peace in its shelter. Much time passed, and a new body was created for the beauty, and now, 80 years later, she was born again, as if returning from the dead, ready to start everything from scratch, but in a completely new appearance. The lady, in complete shock and profound distress, could not hold back her cry when she learned what had happened to her, unable to believe in the miracles that, having become her reality, shook her to the very depths of her soul and changed everything around her. The man, with a knowing expression on his face, handed his companion a mirror and invited her to look at herself so that she could see with her own eyes how much she had changed, because the changes were truly stunning. The beauty, in complete shock, carefully touched her face with her hand, and, noticing her long hair, golden eyes, elastic skin, and refined features, realized that her appearance had become even more perfect and unrecognizably beautiful. While the lady, still shocked, looked at her reflection in surprise, the elf confirmed with slight satisfaction that the experiment with the Tree of Life had been successful and had led to a result that exceeded all expectations. With a serious expression on his face, but with sarcasm in his voice, Zephyr stated with a slight smile that he was probably her father, and the tree, as a joke, was her mother, adding a bit of inappropriate humor that was not well received by everyone around. Before he could finish his sentence, the mirror, darting with lightning speed, crashed right into his forehead, reminding him that his stupid humor was completely inappropriate at the moment and irritated those around him. The beauty, restraining herself, took a sip from her mug, when suddenly he, with a hint of seriousness in his voice, announced that he had news about their former commander named Elkinus, and all attention was immediately riveted to his words. Aaron, upon hearing this news, couldn't help but spit out the drink she was holding in her mouth, horrified to learn that their former partner, with whom they worked side by side, had eventually gone crazy, and this struck her to the depths of her soul. A snap of the finger, and the broom magically rose into the air, moving smoothly and gracefully around the room, as if an invisible magical force controlled its movements, filling the space with a mysterious tension. Elkinus, having captured the dragon's heart in their great battle and being a descendant of the imperial family, soon reached the level of a god, gaining immortality, becoming a being with almost unlimited power, capable of changing the very threads of fate. The irritated lady loudly slammed her hands on the table, raising her eyebrows in displeasure, and asked what had caused the elf to say that their former friend had gone crazy, unable to understand what was hidden behind such harsh accusations. It turned out that for a long time, Elkinus had taken the dragon's egg and was now taking care of it, carefully watching as a red madness flared in his eyes, which gradually penetrated his mind, turning him into something completely different, no longer human. Aaron, shocked to the core and terrified, screamed loudly upon learning that her former comrade had taken the child of an evil monster under his wing, unable to understand why and how he would make such a crazy decision, risking everything for this dangerous entity. Zephyr continued his story about how their friend always did things his own way, not listening to warnings and advice, following his own path, which each time became more dangerous and unpredictable. The egg of the demonic creature lay on the pillow, and the immortal refused to get rid of it, despite the threats and pleading requests of those around him, not realizing all the destructive power hidden inside this sinister artifact. When the Duke publicly declared that he was absolutely against leaving this monster alive, Elkinas did not hesitate to kill the nobleman, pouring blood onto a mirror that immediately reflected his madness and the merciless actions that were the inevitable result. Meanwhile, the squad of knights sent to eliminate the madman was destroyed in a matter of minutes, and all traces of the brave warriors disappeared, as if swallowed by the darkness, leaving no trace. Arin, overcome with shock, jumped up from her seat, not believing her ears, and with her eyes wide open, as if trying to comprehend what was happening, she could not believe what was said. Her gaze was full of bewilderment and surprise. She clutched her head as if trying to tear this ridiculous thought out of herself, and slowly sank to the ground, asking in panic why her friend had gone crazy and started keeping a dragon egg. So dangerous and sinister. Thoughtfully, and with a hint of sadness in his voice, Zephyr said that he had long guessed the reasons for his friend's actions, because dragon creatures capable of controlling time and space have unprecedented powers, and keeping the egg was not an accident. The bloody madman, whose eyes burned with insane determination, clearly sought to return to the past, hoping to change something, perhaps stop some important event that could affect his fate and the fates of those around him. The lady froze, unable to believe it. With wide golden eyes, she looked at the elf when he said that perhaps the young man wanted to change her death, sincerely hoping that this could correct his mistakes. Aaron, unable to bear these words, said with obvious irritation and displeasure that Zephyr was probably talking nonsense, and that she categorically did not believe a single word of it, because she could not understand how it could be true. But Zephyr, putting his hand to his chin, thoughtfully replied that there was still a certain meaning in his words that could not be ignored, because sometimes the true meaning is hidden in the most unexpected statements. The girl reminded them of that old oath when they promised to give their lives if necessary to protect each other, and how important it was for them to remain true to those words, despite everything that was happening around them. Jamil, the lady's best friend, dressed in a dark cloak, seemed to merge with the nightlight of the moon and stars, was the one who was always there, ready to help at any moment, and his presence brought peace and confidence. And suddenly, as if by chance, Arin started talking about Jamil, a love affair with a guy who lost his mind, the queen of the thieves' world, which unexpectedly led them to questions about her role in this story and how she acted at that moment. Holding his gaze and looking upward, the elf quietly said that the maiden, unfortunately, had passed away, devoting herself to the criminal world, and her fate was inevitably sealed by this decision, despite her outstanding talents and incredible abilities. The beauty, feeling growing irritation, confidently stated that, apparently, Elkanas was in love with the thief, and if that were the case, then it was quite logical that they would have gotten married, because their relationship always seemed more than just friendly. Zephyr, taken aback by the unexpected suggestion, explained with obvious bewilderment in his voice that there had never been a wedding between their comrades, and, moreover, he was absolutely sure that Elkinas had never had feelings for this woman, leaving his interlocutor in shock. The lady stood in silence, feeling a little silly as she realized that her previous assumptions about the close relationship between the friends had turned out to be wrong and did not correspond to reality, leaving her confused. The elf listened to her words with weariness, not believing that she sincerely believed that there could ever have been a romantic connection between their comrades, because their relationship was far from personal and never went beyond friendship. The small house they were in was secluded in the forest, surrounded by greenery and the tranquility of nature, creating an atmosphere of peace and quiet in which every sound was a little louder. It turned out that Jamil and Elkinas used to often train on the battlefield, where they, like two skilled dancers, moved synchronously in battle, always ready to cover each other at the most crucial moment, supporting each other in difficult situations. Dancing in battle, they seemed to be one, ready to protect each other from any blow. But the man, despite his resilience, was also ready to help the sorceress if she only asked for his help, without thinking about the risk. However, what was even more important and a little mysterious was that the pair often exchanged whispers in private, with the lady with a sly grin seeming to be searching for answers, while the young man, always with a serious face, was thoughtful and hidden in his thoughts. After such conversations, when they exchanged words in private, the handsome man's face would often flush with embarrassment, His eyes would burn like fire, as if he was embarrassed by what he was hiding in his heart, not daring to share it with others. The elf turned away, with a hint of frustration in his voice, explaining that he could not explain the reason for their friend's behavior, since it was the guy's duty to tell everything himself, but it seemed he did not consider it necessary to reveal these details. Elkinus should have explained everything to the lady personally, but for some reason he did not, leaving many questions unanswered and creating an atmosphere of uncertainty that only gave rise to more doubts. When Arin first saw her friend, she was walking with her mother to pick herbs, a little girl with two neat pigtails on the sides and a green dress that emphasized her innocence and childish joy. Elkinus was at that time the most vulnerable child in the village, constantly subjected to ridicule and blows from other boys, who openly hated him for his peculiarities and for the fact that he was so different from them. The little girl was so angry at the cruelty and injustice with which the children treated the poor boy that, in order to frighten them, she pretended to call for the knights, hoping that her words would make the villains run away. The frightened boys immediately jumped to their feet and ran away in panic, fearing punishment for their actions, because they never expected that such a little girl could dare to scare them away in such a decisive manner. After everything had calmed down, the girl leaned over her wounded friend with concern, gently asking if he was okay, and offering him a helping hand, hoping that her care could at least ease his suffering a little and restore his strength. And so they became inseparable friends. Poor Elkinas, in old shabby clothes, covered in abrasions and dirt, and the girl, determined to protect him in any situation, not paying attention to the risks and dangers that could lie in wait for them at every step. As they grew up, the girl began to take the boy for walks in the forest, hoping that they could forget and at least ease Elkinas's mental pain a little, trying to return him a sense of peace and happiness in their shared adventures. Later, the girl, beaming with excitement, showed her friend the spirits that only she could see, while the others remained in the dark. They were luminous fish that seemed to float in the air, breaking the laws of nature, leaving a luminous trail behind them. They moved everywhere, gliding gracefully through the air as if they did not feel the weight of the earth. All around there was silence. Only snowflakes were falling from the sky, and at that moment, in the winter chill, the sounds of their laughter sounded like an echo in the void. One day, as if by fate, the young man disappeared, and it turned out that he was a descendant of a famous duke, whose coat of arms was decorated with a dagger with spread wings, symbolizing the strength and power that remained in his family for centuries. Their meeting took place 12 years later, when the blue sky that filled the horizon silently watched the clouds float by in the ordinary daylight, and at that moment, time seemed to stop, returning them to the past. Arin was sitting there at the time, fully focused on tending to the plants, her fingers carefully tugging at the leaves. But a sudden shadow overhead made her freeze, and in a slight shock, she slowly looked up, meeting a painfully familiar figure. The guy slowly pulled the hood off his head, letting the wind tousle his hair, and, without taking his attentive gaze off his interlocutor, he chuckled slightly, a barely perceptible note of warm mockery sounding in his voice when he finally said a greeting. Elkinus, looking at her, gave her a soft, sincere smile, which reflected genuine joy, and a slight glimmer of fun in his eyes spoke more eloquently than any words that he was truly glad to see her again, as if time could not erase the warm memories of the past. Sitting down on a moss-covered log, the nobleman, slowly choosing his words, began to tell his childhood friend about how, after a long absence, he had returned to his family, sincerely hoping to earn their recognition, but every step towards him turned into only cold indifference. However, instead of the expected warmth and support, he was faced with cold looks, disdain, and reluctance from his relatives to recognize him as the heir, as if the past meant more to them than he did, and neither title nor origin could change their attitude. With a slight, barely noticeable smile, in which a faint hope shone through, the girl finally decided to ask the question that worried her most, and, looking into his eyes, gently asked whether he was going to stay in the village or if this was just a temporary stop before his further journey. The man slowly looked up, his eyes reflecting deep sadness, and without taking his attentive gaze off her, He quietly but confidently said that he would not stay here for long, since he had only arrived for a short time, and would soon leave these places again, returning home. It turned out that he had come here not of his own free will, but on orders to track down and defeat an evil dragon, whose existence had long inspired fear and anxiety in the locals, and whose presence now threatened the entire area. This news was a real shock for the lady, and, unable to contain her emotions, she screamed loudly, because it was not just a monster that was being discussed, but a real demonic spawn, a meeting with which could be fatal even for the most experienced warrior. Bowing his head slightly and maintaining an imperturbable expression, the young man replied that this was precisely the reason he had come to her, because their paths would soon cross again, and he was sure that a new meeting awaited them ahead, which would be no less significant than today's. However, Aaron did not let him finish, jumped up abruptly, and, burning with determination, firmly declared that she would not allow him to go on such a dangerous mission alone, so she would go with him to hunt the dragon and prove that she could be a worthy companion to him. The lady added with unshakable confidence that even in childhood, her now deceased mother had told her about the secrets of magic, since she herself was a sorceress, and since then this power had become an integral part of her being. And the wind playfully ruffling her hair seemed to confirm her words. Elkinas, gently placing his hands on her fragile shoulders, tried to calm his friend, restrainedly and carefully explaining that he did not want to take her with him, because the path he had taken was too dangerous, and he could not allow her to risk her life and get injured. However, Aaron objected, stating that he was mistaken if he thought he could guarantee her safety, since even he himself was not immune to danger, and therefore the only correct decision was to accompany him in this difficult test. Without a moment's hesitation, she stepped forward and, putting her arms around his shoulders, said with unexpected force that she could not stand aside, fully aware that a mortal battle awaited him ahead, and the thought that he might not return was unacceptable to her. Elkinas, still deeply impressed by the decisive words of his interlocutor, listened to her with surprise, feeling how pleasantly his heart was filled with warmth from her determination. His gray eyes could not tear themselves away from her face, and a strange tremor spread through his soul. At first the young man was silent, absorbed in his thoughts, but soon, after he realized that her will was as strong as his own, he agreed with a slight sigh to take her with him on this dangerous journey, deciding that now their paths would become inseparable. Gently taking her hand, he intertwined his fingers with hers, holding her palm firmly and confidently in his, as if to make it clear that on the path they had to go through, they would be close, shoulder to shoulder, despite all the hardships and trials. Then, unable to contain his impulse, he knelt down on one knee in front of the lady, and, with sincere admiration in his voice, began to shower her with words of compliments, in which he extolled her beauty, courage, and inner charm, realizing that she deserved much more than simple words. Embarrassed by her attention, the girl blushed to the tips of her ears, and her eyes widened in surprise. Her soul was in slight shock from how sincerely and touchingly he expressed his feelings, making her heart beat faster. Elkinas added, with a warm smile on his face, that for him she was not only a faithful companion, but also a best friend, and these words sounded with such sincerity that her heart began to beat faster and her gaze filled with a soft light. Thus, standing on the ground, among the green expanses of the forest, the man, slightly bowing his head, thoughtfully addressed the lady, asking if she would agree to spend her life next to him, making this moment even more important and significant for their common destiny. After that, he gently touched her hands with his lips, as if asking that, despite all the trials, they could stay close and continue their journey together, despite all the difficulties and disagreements that they would have to endure. Unable to contain her emotions, Aaron let tears full of bitterness and pain slowly roll down her cheeks, and her golden eyes, reflecting the inner suffering and regret, revealed all the pain that engulfed her heart after hearing the words. She still couldn't believe that her dear and sweet old friend, whom she had known for so many years, had suddenly turned into the greatest enemy, a threat to the entire continent, something she couldn't even predict. The villain, who hides in the shadows and hides from the eyes of others, being the object of hatred and contempt, turned away from the whole world, hiding his face behind his back, as if trying to avoid all those emotions and disappointments that haunt him. Zephyr, with an expression of obvious displeasure, replied that the maiden was exaggerating too much, asserting that their friend's character had not been so blameless and ideal from the very beginning as she might have imagined, and that his behavior had always left many questions. The young man, often showing contempt for those around him, behaved disgustingly in most situations, but only in rare moments, when the sorceress was nearby, he became softer, showing that he had something more than just coldness. The beauty, unable to contain her irritation, shouted sharply, demanding that her interlocutor immediately stop saying such offensive and ridiculous words about her friend, because she could not allow anyone to humiliate him like that. After all, in the past, he had been so nice to her that he would bend his knees to a country bumpkin like her, showing his devotion and care, while she could not appreciate his actions, not noticing the true value of his attention. When the lady who had accepted the friendship with her former childhood friend noticed that he was upset, that for her he was just a friend and nothing more, she seemed not to pay attention to it and, smiling broadly, continued to behave as if nothing had happened. Zephyr, after silently listening to the question of what had happened to the rest of their teammates, fell into a brief thoughtfulness before, with obvious indifference to what was happening around him, he nevertheless answered without attaching much importance to it. Finding herself in a new role, Chania became the head of the church, and, despite being 90 years old, continued her ministry with amazing fortitude, overcoming all the obstacles that stood in her way. Gador, returning to his tribe after many trials and adventures, took the honorable place of leader. His confidence and experience allowed him to strengthen his leadership position and prove his worth among his fellow tribesmen. The girl, with confusion in her eyes, realized that of their entire group, only Elkanas had a sad future. He went into the darkness, unable to withstand the trials, unlike the others who continued their path. Despite all the difficulties, Zephyr, noticing how the maiden had fallen back into her old habits, dropping her head to the floor in deep sadness, quietly muttered something under his breath, as if not wanting to interfere, but at the same time expressing his disappointment in her behavior. The sorceress, desperately trying to cope with the sadness that was inexorably gaining strength, slowly sipped from her mug. Each sip was like an attempt to drown out the feelings that tormented her soul, growing with each passing day, giving her no peace. Loudly putting the cup on the table, she made a decision with clear determination that echoed in her thoughts, as if this moment had become decisive, when there was no turning back, and all responsibility for the further course of events lay only with her. Arin, having firmly decided to go to her former teammate, understood that this conversation had become inevitable, and, perhaps, it would open up new perspectives for her that could change everything in their relationship and understanding of each other. She was determined to get rid of the egg of that monstrous creature that the young man was keeping, because its existence had become a serious threat, and she knew that she could no longer afford to remain aloof from this evil. Bones, blood, earth, and destruction. These words, like ominous omens, swirled around in her head, reminding her that her actions could lead to inevitable consequences that could not be avoided, no matter how hard she tried. She could no longer allow herself to repeat the tragedy that had happened in the past, because it had left deep scars in her soul, and now she was ready to do anything to avoid returning herself to that darkness and repeating those mistakes. The lady shuddered when she heard the question that was asked of her, because she did not think that Elkanas, despite everything, would decide to listen to her, leaving in her heart the hope that perhaps she could change his mind and return everything to its place. With a self-confident smile on her face, the beauty stated with absolute certainty that the guy would easily recognize her at first sight because she was his best friend, and despite the time that had passed, their connection remained strong and unbreakable. Zephyr bitterly realized that he would not be able to convince the girl of her delusions, and, unable to contain his feelings any longer, with an upset expression on his face, he jumped up from his chair and began to rise, as if this was the only thing that could help him cope with his emotions. The lady shuddered when she heard the words that Elkanas would not be able to kill her and destroy her body, because it was created by a magical tree, whose magical power was so great that it protected her from any harm and invisible threats. Finding himself in a difficult situation, Zephyr realized that, although he could not fully control his appearance, he nevertheless did not age a day in all the past decades, as if time had slowed down for him and his essence had not been touched. The transformation was a unique and complex technique designed to allow dragons to exist in the human world while hiding their true nature, without drawing too much attention to their magical power and antiquity. After each transformation, the monster was forced to take a break, lasting approximately 1,000 years, to fully restore its strength and restore balance to its body, because without this, it risked losing the ability to maintain human form. Or, if a break were impossible, he could interrupt the transformation, returning to his original form, thereby losing all those human traits and virtues that were acquired in the process of transformation. Waving his hand in mild irritation, Zephyr began to say that the transformation was absolutely necessary for the successful completion of their mission, and his assessment of what was happening was not only accurate, but also extremely logical, without room for error. At that moment, a scroll appeared in front of him, and the guy, looking at the noblewoman with curiosity, asked what title she would like to become, perhaps a duchess or a countess, hoping that her choice would open up new horizons for them. Zephyr, with a slight surprise in his voice, noted that the girl should come up with a new name for herself, because it would be absolutely unreasonable to come to their former friend and declare that she had returned from the dead after a whole century of death without raising many questions. The girl could not hide her smile when she heard the offer to become an aristocrat, because she had always dreamed of such a life, full of magnificent balls, sophisticated tea parties in the best halls, and the opportunity to wear crinolines, in which she could feel like a real lady. Zephyr, realizing her wishes, unexpectedly told her that she had been given a title after her death and was now glorified as the Empire's state mage, which gave her incredible importance and respect that she had not expected. Arin, shocked by this unexpected turn of events, blushed in embarrassment, unable to believe what was said, and, pressing her hand to her cheek, plunged into shock and delight, feeling how her emotions overwhelmed her, and her mind did not yet have time to comprehend what had happened. The man, noticing her condition, smiled understandingly and said that before continuing on their way, it would be wise for them to visit her grave to pay their last respects and honor to her memory before moving on. The man's hand paused on the name of the famous Count of the Empire written on the scroll, and the elf, deciding that this would be the best option, declared that they would make her the daughter of this nobleman in order to create the necessary connections and relationships for further plans. Erin, with a startled shudder, realized the intentions of her interlocutor, and her face expressed strong anger and fear. She could not believe that she was being drawn into such madness, but in her eyes there was a desire to resist. The elf suddenly changed his appearance, turning into the youngest count. His gray hair was combed back, and his appearance acquired maturity, becoming much more attractive, as if he had matured by 40 years, and now looked like a true aristocrat. The man was clearly pleased with his new appearance, as if he himself was delighted with his own transformation. And the lady muttered embarrassedly, unable to hide her reaction to what she saw, because in front of her was a completely different person. Zephyr, smiling, explained that he was to play the role of a count who was escorting his daughter to the capital to delight her with the balls and social conversations that she loved so much, and all this was to be part of their further plan. The noblewoman stood on the top of the hill, the wind gently touching her curly hair, and her dress, fluttering, seemed to float in the air, as if reflecting her inner harmony. And in the dark night, her gaze was directed to the tree of life, which stood majestically before her. She looked up at the sky full of endless stars, and deep down she felt gratitude filling her heart. For this tree had undoubtedly brought her back to life, and she spoke words of respect and admiration, with sincere gratitude for the gift of a second life. But the tree, despite all her words and questions, remained quiet and mute, as if not wanting to answer, and its silence was felt especially acutely in the midst of this calm, as if it had been swallowed up by the endless expanse of the night. Bowing her head, she thanked the tree again for the second chance it had given her, for the opportunity to live her life again, and, taking a step forward, she felt the determination to continue on her way without looking back. Then, looking up, she wondered if she would ever be able to return to this place if fate cut her life short again, and the thought of death did not leave her. But despite this, she resolutely continued her journey forward, full of hopes and expectations. Her golden eyes flashed brightly, and her hands convulsively grabbed the tree bark, as if she was trying to hold on, feeling how at that moment, the thought of staying next to this tree forever, not wanting to part with it, flashed through her mind. Suddenly, a strong wind blew, and the lady, losing her balance, leaned against the bark of a plant, as if someone invisible had pushed her. And trying not to fall, she hugged the pole tightly in order to maintain stability and not lose support on her feet. Erin smiled with a feeling of deep satisfaction, realizing that this was not just a gust of wind, but a response of consent from the plant itself, which, as if understanding her state of mind, was trying to comfort her and support her in a difficult moment. With a laugh, the aristocrat let go of the tree, feeling its gentle power radiate through her touch, and ran away with ease, leaving behind the wind that blew through her hair, and in her heart the warmth of farewell to nature remained. In the morning, when the first rays of the sun touched the earth, Zephyr stood outside, waiting for his new daughter, and, meeting her gaze, asked a question, to which she answered with a smile, telling that she had been talking with the world tree all night, discovering its ancient wisdom. In addition, the plant, as if giving a part of its power, left her a gift of several branches with green leaves, which became not only a memorable gift, but also a symbol of a new, strong connection with this powerful living creature, guarding the ancient secrets of nature. Zephyr, with obvious surprise in his voice, noted that apparently the maiden was truly her tree's favorite, since it decided to gift her with sacred leaves, which were considered extremely valuable and revered in their world, symbolizing a deep connection with nature. The beauty laughed evilly, assuring that she had long known about the indisputable value of these leaves, and by selling them at auction, she would certainly become incredibly rich, and her name would sound in the highest circles of aristocrats as a symbol of success and sophistication. Suddenly, the man grabbed her hand, pulling her hard, because they had many urgent matters that required immediate completion, and every moment was worth its weight in gold in their difficult and intense work, where time played a decisive role. At that moment, her hand snapped in the air, and the white glove, touching her skin, left a feeling of cold and stern care on her, as if reminding her that she was not just a part of this game, but an important figure in its center. The two of them found themselves in the city, moving around a large house surrounded by stone, where fresh air filled their lungs, and the cities seemed to swallow them up, plunging them into a world of vanity and speed, where everything happened at incredible speed. The man firmly ordered the sorceress to follow him, not lagging behind, and his words began to merge with the noise, as if she was losing her hearing, and the world around her became more and more distant and fuzzy, as if reality was beginning to crumble into fragments. Her golden eyes widened in shock, her gaze becoming blurry as if she was trying to comprehend what was happening, but everything was dissolving into endless chaos, leaving her in a state of deep confusion and utter bewilderment, as if reality had lost all clarity. Once in the very center of the city, they quickly realized that they were in the capital of the Elkanas, whose influence spread to every street, and whose power here was unquestionable, so much so that even the air around seemed to be saturated with its power. Life was in full swing here, and the couple, deciding not to attract unnecessary attention to themselves, disappeared into the crowd, hoping that no one would notice them in this crowded place, full of hidden dangers and secrets on which their future and safety depended. The city, named Iron, struck by its grandeur. Wide streets, tall buildings, squares and corners, filled with life, created an atmosphere where every building, every corner was part of a large, living organism. The girl looked around with keen interest, her eyes shining with delight as she saw how the city was preparing for a grand celebration, a festival that was a long-awaited event that united all residents in joy and fun. The holiday was special because it was on this day that a great victory was celebrated. The evil and bad dragon was destroyed, and this day became a symbol of triumph over darkness, which was celebrated annually with pride and gratitude. A lady, passing by the counter, noticed a man who was calling her over, offering her a fragrant shashlik, from which came a delicious smell that filled the air and instantly whetted the appetite of every passerby. The shock in the lady's eyes was obvious when she first thought that it might be dragon meat in front of her, but the man, noticing her doubt, announced that it was actually a kebab of ordinary chicken, nothing more, which immediately dispelled her fears. The elf who was giving the tour to his companion enthusiastically pointed out various sights of the city, telling her in detail where everything was located, and allowing her to immerse herself in the atmosphere of this living and multi-layered place. There, in the very center of the city, in a prominent place, stood a majestic statue of the hero, a maiden with a staff in her hands, frozen in a noble pose, as if ready to come to the rescue at any moment, protecting her city from any threats. Looking more closely, it became absolutely clear that this was Arin, the very heroine of the city who defeated the dragon and forever left her mark on its history, becoming a symbol of unwavering strength and courage for all residents. The sorceress herself, however, did not immediately recognize herself in the form of a statue, and, peering curiously at the stone, she tried to understand who exactly was depicted, examining every detail, which aroused her keen interest and surprise. When the realization dawned on her that it was herself depicted before her, the shock in her eyes was obvious. They opened wide, reflecting emotions she could not hide, and her heart pounded with surprise and excitement. Pointing her finger at the stone figure, the lady exclaimed in surprise, realizing that it was her own statue, an image that became a symbol of her great feat and heroism, forever immortalized in this city, becoming part of its history. The lady, clutching her head and stunned by this discovery, asked in complete bewilderment why they had erected a monument to her, and why her name had become so significant for the entire city, where she had previously been just a traveler. Zephyr, standing next to her, explained with a slight smile that the entire city was named after her, which completely confused his companion, making her feel both proud and embarrassed by such a surprising display of recognition. People happily walked around them, sang songs and chatted, because this day was dedicated to the heroine who saved her fellow citizens and became a real symbol of strength and courage for them, without whom they would not have survived that terrible moment. This monument became a sacred place for all magicians who believed that touching its stone sculptures would grant a special blessing that would help improve their magical powers and enhance the magical mastery they were so proud of. The oak staff, which became a symbol of strength and wisdom, was kept in a sacred temple, and only once a year it was put on display for the townspeople, allowing everyone to worship this holy artifact, which had long become an important part of their traditions and history. Erin, in shock and surprise, pointed her finger at herself, not believing that a whole celebration was being held in her honor, because everyone around her loved her and mourned her loss, which was a real discovery for her, as if the world had changed in her eyes. The noble lady, the owner of this cozy studio, and her experienced dressmakers, with sincere smiles and bows, greeted their clients, ready to help the nobles with any requests, assuring them that they could count on the highest level of service and craftsmanship. Zephyr held out a bag of money, declaring that the lady should sew them dresses as soon as possible, so that they would be not only beautiful, but also expensive, corresponding to their status, so that nothing could overshadow their greatness in this society. The man continued to speak in old, even somewhat outdated phrases, and Arin could not help but notice how much her friend's character had changed. His words became harsher, and his manner of communication became dry and detached, which truly surprised her. The lady, with a shy exclamation, could not believe that she was going to wear such expensive clothes, because she already had on a beautiful peach dress with white sleeves, decorated with bows and precious stones, which seemed to her enough decoration for any occasion. The sorceress, with slight regret, asked her adoptive father to stop trying on clothes and take some time to rest, because she was very tired and felt that all this preparation for the holiday required too much strength and attention. The owner of the studio, meanwhile, did not stop showering the client with compliments, claiming that each dress, as if created for her, sat perfectly on her figure, which invariably surprised and delighted the sorceress, filling her heart with a strange warmth. The sorceress felt awkward, because she had never been accustomed to such luxurious and refined outfits. Her soul seemed to be shaking from the unusual sensation, and she could not get rid of the thought that all this was too magnificent for her. Zephyr, who was sitting on the sofa and watching the proceedings, announced that after the fitting, they would be heading to his estate, where they had a number of affairs and obligations that required immediate attention, which filled the atmosphere with anticipation. Suddenly, a letter appeared in the man's hand, which he quickly pulled out, showing it off. Zephyr often used mail magic to communicate with people and receive important news, transmitting messages through fire, which was always his special method. Zephyr, absorbed in reading the message, suddenly said that the message came from the spy's assistant, whom he had sent to the imperial palace on an important mission, thus revealing another difficult task that required immediate attention. Staying close to the lady, she suddenly realized that her faithful companion had cast a silent spell on them so that no one could overhear their conversation, thus making their conversation absolutely confidential and hidden from prying eyes. The first news they received was astonishing. A red dragon had arrived at the palace, changed its appearance for the first time in many years, and disappeared inside, personifying a mystery and arousing anxiety among all present. The man sighed in annoyance, waved his hand, and said that the second piece of news was that the lady urgently needed to tear off a leaf from the healing wreath and swallow it, as it was necessary for her safety in the current situation. The noblewoman, in complete shock and unable to understand what was happening, asked again why he had so insistently demanded that she immediately carry out this strange and, at first glance, absurd instruction, without realizing the full depth and seriousness of the situation. It turned out that returning from the Duke's estate would not be as easy and quick as they had hoped, and every step they took now became critically important, because in this dangerous and unpredictable world, even the slightest mistake could change their fate forever. The lady standing nearby, without any questions or hesitation, obediently began to eat the leaves at her friend's command, realizing that at that moment it was important to follow his instructions, because their safety and the success of the entire enterprise depended on it. They got into the carriage, and the journey through the forest began. The horses, with each step, loudly clattered on the ground, creating a rhythmic and almost magical accompaniment to their path, as if nature itself was watching their movement through these mystical forests. Arin, filled with shock and surprise, almost unconsciously pressed her hand to the carriage window, when suddenly something amazing happened. They teleported, and the forest disappeared, giving way to a completely new and mysterious place, where every moment was filled with strange excitement. These barriers served as a border, dividing the city and the noble estate, creating an invisible barrier that seemed to protect the peace and grandeur of the noble house, isolating it from the bustle of the outside world, and leaving an atmosphere of secluded well-being inside. The Duke's mansion was enormous, filled with many corridors and hidden passages, each leading to new secrets, encompassing a space where aristocratic luxury coexisted with danger. Zephyr suggested that they could use the festival as a cover to sneak into the nobleman's house, as in the midst of the festivities, when everyone was engrossed in the merriment and noise, their presence would not arouse any suspicion. Erin confirmed that she had thoroughly chewed all the leaves that had been given to her, and now, feeling fully prepared, she was confident that her preparation would be sufficient to overcome the next challenge that lay ahead of them. Finally, they arrived at the estate, and Zephyr tenderly helped the lady out of the carriage, holding her hand tightly, as if supporting her in this important and exciting new moment that they were experiencing together, as if by magic. The noblewoman got out of the carriage and began to look around the majestic mansion with admiration, covering her mouth with her hand so as not to reveal her surprise at what she saw. Every corner of the palace was filled with wonders that took her breath away. The lady could not contain her emotions and cried out, exclaiming about the incredible beauty of the Duke's palace, which, in her opinion, was so magnificent that it would seem to be part of the imperial family, reflecting their power and grandeur. And then, unexpectedly, another person joined them. It was the butler, who, noticing the new guests, quickly approached them, preparing to show them all the necessary honors and invite them inside so that they could enjoy the reception. Zephyr frowned, muttering slightly to himself that he was in complete shock that this old man was still alive despite his immense age, and in his opinion, it seemed like even time couldn't defeat him. When he finally got a closer look at him, it turned out that this man was a half-elf, and his soul, as the maiden's friend said, was blacker than night, consumed by dark secrets, which immediately made him wary and feel threatened. There was an immediate feeling of mutual dislike between them, and the rudeness with which they exchanged glances was so obvious that it was as if lightning had pierced the air, leaving the tension that hung in the atmosphere invisible but palpable. Zephyr, clearly irritated by the situation and the reluctance to continue this unpleasant conversation, waved his hand sharply and, not paying attention to further events, turned around when he was recognized. All this happened against the background of screams that broke the silence. Arin flinched when she was suddenly addressed by name, calling her a noble lady, which caused a slight confusion in her soul, since she was not used to such respectful addresses in this place, so far from her usual life. She bowed politely, slightly bowing her head, containing her inner excitement, and greeted the butler, feeling his piercing gaze on her, full of deep respect and genuine expectation, which was conveyed through his manners. Carlotte, as the servant was called, placed his hand on his heart as a sign of respect, and, with a serious look, began to suggest options where the nobles could stay during the holiday, pointing to several rooms suitable for guests. The butler slowly led the count and his daughter through a long carpeted corridor, trying to show them where the Archduke was, because they had finally arrived to see him and had to go to his private chambers to meet. As they walked, Zephyr, who was walking next to the lady, quietly addressed her, drawing her attention to something important that clearly required her concentration, and she could not help but notice how seriously he said it. The noblewoman, stunned and overcome with excitement, listened with great surprise to the elf's confession, because he had finally revealed something important to her that he had been hiding for a long time, and thoughts began to flash through her head about what might await her in the future, full of surprises. When they finally arrived, they found Elkinas sitting on his throne, a war hero, a man whose strength and determination were so great that he was incredibly difficult to control, and his decisions were always unpredictable. The imperial family suggested that he arrange a political marriage in order to manipulate and control the duke, believing it to be the best way to strengthen their position and influence in these turbulent times. However, Elkinas, resolutely rejecting this plan, refused the marriage, and in a furious impulse destroyed his enemies in order to take possession of the dragon's egg. His determination was so strong and unwavering that no one could stop him. At last, they came to the right door, and Carlotte, as if to confirm their arrival, loudly announced it, while a pair of nobles, standing to one side, watched with reserve, awaiting further instructions and the decision that was to follow. Elkinas stood in the hall, still surprising with his appearance, with black, like a raven's wing, hair and an elegant, formal suit. A mysterious smile played on his face, leaving many questions unanswered. In the same room where the other guests were, the girl and the guy were sitting a little to the side, paying attention to what was happening, as if not interfering, but their presence was noticeable, and every glance reflected a certain interest. Elkinas, bowing his head and keeping silent for a moment, suddenly thanked the girl sitting next to him for returning to him alive, despite all the trials that had befallen her, and this confession sounded sincere and touched her. Arin, shocked to the core, realized with surprise that she was the one sitting to the side, as the girl had the same appearance as her, freckles on her cheeks, brown curly hair, and a mysterious smile that she always wore. The lady sitting to the side looked almost like her own reflection, freckles, dark curly hair, and that same soft smile that usually played on her lips, creating the impression of some kind of mystery and enigma. Arin, still not understanding how this was possible, could not comprehend that her double was standing right in this room, as the similarity between them was striking, and she could not believe what was happening, as if trying to find an explanation. Elkinas, noticing her confusion, smiled kindly and asked his interlocutor if she could, by chance, remind him of that very day when they fought with the dragon and defeated him, trying to extract something important from this memory. The real Aaron, shocked, listened in surprise to the retelling of what happened between her and the guy in the distant past, when she tried to calm him down, crying from pity and empathy, not realizing that what was happening was not hiding everything. However, she gradually began to realize in her mind that some of the moments described in the story did not match what she remembered, and her internal anxiety grew stronger, since something did not add up in the version of events that was presented to her. Standing in the haze, consumed by the feeling of an elusive deception, Aaron suddenly realized that everything around her was a carefully constructed lie. Every word, every detail, everything seemed false, like a powerful illusion hiding the true face of what was happening. In front of her sat an exact copy of herself, telling lies, rewriting history, inventing things that had not happened in the past. And Aaron realized that her real memory was the only thing that remained unchanged in this distorted world. Elkinas, still smiling, stood up from his seat and nodded gratefully to his interlocutor, appreciating her speech. The man's gaze was full of respect, but suddenly anxious sparks flashed in his eyes, and his facial expression changed. Suddenly, cruelty appeared on his face. His eyes glowed red, and his grin became predatory, like a man who had been betrayed. He said that he realized that he had been openly lied to his face, and the memories he had lived with were completely different. The fake Aaron, trying to justify her actions, tried to explain that everything that happened was so long ago, and her memory may have failed her, but her words got tangled in her throat, and she fell silent, not knowing how to get out of this dangerous situation. Blood quickly filled the lady's face, her eyes filled with horror, fear, and inexpressible pain, and a tremor ran through her body from a strong blow that came so unexpectedly that she did not even have time to understand what exactly happened at that moment. The Duke, with genuine cruelty and coldness in his eyes, wounded his interlocutor with one powerful swing of his sword, not sparing her, and then, with contempt, declared that the imperial family, apparently, really imagined itself so powerful as to send a spy to him. He watched calmly as the girl cowered in the corner, calling her a fool with genuine malice in his voice for her ridiculous attempt to lie, making her own lie look even more ridiculous and pathetic in his eyes. The girl, realizing that her life was hanging by a thread, fell to her knees, desperately trying to justify herself to the nobleman, asking for forgiveness, begging for mercy, hoping that her tears could soften his heart at least for a moment. The entire retinue silently watched this scene as her pleas for mercy rang in the air, but no one dared to intervene. Everyone was absorbed in waiting for what end awaited this unfortunate woman in such a merciless situation. Elkina stood silently, staring at the girl who had fallen to the floor, not showing the slightest emotion. His face remained impassive, as if he was devoid of any feelings for this pathetic scene unfolding before him. However, a moment later, he raised his sword and gently lifted the girl's chin, forcing her to meet his gaze, and then, with a mocking voice, said that she was completely different from his real ex-girlfriend, emphasizing her insignificance. Quietly, with a hint of indifference in his voice, he added that the lady should convey to the imperial family that their plan had suffered a final defeat and no longer had any meaning, as if the whole undertaking had been completed and nothing could be fixed. After these words, Elkinus gave the order, ordering his interlocutor to leave his presence immediately, and she, in fear and gratitude for the preservation of her life, immediately jumped to her feet and rushed away in panic, not daring to look back anymore. Aaron watched in shock and silent horror, unable to believe that her former friend, with whom she had once shared so many close moments, had turned into such a cold and cruel man who now seemed alien to her. In her memories, like in fragments, only bright and warm moments associated with him were stored. Every moment was filled with light and peace, as if they were living their happiest period in life, not knowing that all this would soon change. But all these memories were shattered when she realized that Elkanas had become a madman consumed by blood rage, his mind consumed by the shadow of madness, and he was no longer the man she once knew and loved. Suddenly, the Duke ordered that new clothes be brought to him, since the old ones, soaked in blood, no longer corresponded to his high status, and the servant immediately brought him a new set, as if he did not notice the horror that was happening around him. The girl, looking away, instinctively covered her mouth with her hand, realizing what the elf meant when he said that their friend had become insane and dangerous, because his lost sanity was obvious even to those who knew him best. Elkinus, as if nothing had happened, and not paying attention to those present, began to unbutton his shirt in front of everyone, intending to change it for a new one, not at all embarrassed, and demonstrating complete calmness, which confused those around him. The noblewoman blushed with embarrassment when her gaze involuntarily fell on the naked skin of her companion, and she, feeling the blush fill her cheeks, with difficulty looked away, trying to hide her awkward state, which seemed to be noticeable to everyone. She turned awkwardly to avoid looking at the naked man, her face burning with shame, and the blush on her cheeks growing brighter as she couldn't shake the awkward feeling that was coming over her at the thought of what was happening. Elkinus, on the contrary, did not pay any attention to the guest's reaction, but, calmly examining them, asked with slight surprise why Carlotte had brought them to him, not understanding what could have been the reason for their visit and what had attracted their attention to his person. The butler, bowing respectfully before the gentleman, announced that the guests had expressed a desire to meet him and that they were important persons whose presence could not go unnoticed in this house, where everything had to be at the highest level. The young man, looking at the guests with a cold and penetrating gaze, began to methodically list all his old acquaintances, trying to understand who exactly had come to him, as if he was trying to find answers in his memories of people from the past who had once been familiar to him. As soon as the Duke realized who exactly had come to him, his face darkened and rage flared in his eyes. He was ready to immediately go on the offensive against the elf-man with whom he had to resolve all the issues that had accumulated over the years of his reign. A wild grin appeared in his eyes as red rage filled his mind, and with sarcasm on his lips, the nobleman said that he had been looking for this elf for a long time, and now he himself had come right into his hands, like a gift from fate. The man, consumed with rage and madness, angrily ordered Zephyr to answer him truthfully and immediately, leaving no room for doubt, his voice full of menace and his gaze a sharp point ready to pierce anyone who stood in his way. Erin, with a look of shock on her face, watched wordlessly as her friend was tortured by their own teammate, unable to believe what was happening right before her eyes, as he, with a cold detachment, interrogated him about the location of the sorceress's orb. The room was dark. The atmosphere was oppressive and tense. There was a dark energy in the air, as if the magic itself was filled with negativity and evil, leaving a feeling that everything around was absorbing light and hope, turning the space into a cold and gloomy living room. It is not surprising that her former friend was able to immediately notice the disappearance of the sorceress's spiritual sphere, because such important artifacts could not go unnoticed, and the disappearance of this item immediately attracted her attention as an important detail in this complex matter. With irritation that if the elf did not answer him truthfully, he would immediately finish him off, leaving no room for objections or hesitation. His words sounded like a sentence, and his face was cut with anger and determination. Zephyr, however, was not one to be easily frightened, and with an ironic smile on his lips, paying no attention to the threats, he quickly replied that the Duke might try to get at least a word out of him, but it would be much more difficult than he could imagine. The nobleman's eyes were bloodshot. His scarlet eyes, with sharp pupils like a flame, burned with hatred, and all his anger was reflected in this look, which was so piercing that it could break through any barrier. The aristocrat shuddered, feeling the evil and heavy aura emanating from the guy, who was so confident in his abilities that he was ready to use torture to extract the truth from the elf, not doubting that this would bring the desired result. The young man was no longer the hero she remembered him as, because Elkinas, who had turned into a cold and cruel man, had lost all his kindness and compassion, and was now ready to do anything for his goal, sparing no one. The lady, with bitterness in her heart, closed her eyes, realizing that she had lost not just an acquaintance, but her friend, someone she had once trusted, and now her soul was tormented by a feeling of loss, because she could not understand how everything could have changed so much, how this person had become who he had become. At this time, the Duke's fingers were tightening ever more. His determination was becoming unbending, and he was determined to extract the truth at any cost, even if it meant breaking the will and spirit of his opponent. The lady's body was purified by the holy spring, but her soul was never found, having disappeared into an unknown space, leaving a feeling of loss, as if it had dissolved into a dark void, leaving no trace or hope of return. The boy, with desperate determination, shook the nobleman violently, not wanting to waste time, demanding an immediate answer to the question of where the sorceress's spiritual sphere was, which could bring back to life what was lost, and he was ready to go to the end to find it. Zephyr, with a cold smile on his face, spoke the words with a double meaning, emphasizing that all this time Arin could have been there, but perhaps she was hiding this truth, leaving everything in the shadows, as if she was aware of something that no one knew about. The aristocrat, standing in complete shock, could not hide her confusion when her gaze met Elkines's, and her hands, unconsciously, pressed to her chest, as if trying to protect herself from the gaze that pierced her, as if reading her thoughts. In the past, the two of them had shared joys and sorrows together, and it seemed like there would always be a special bond between them. But now, standing in front of each other, they felt how they had changed, and it was impossible to believe that everything had once been different. But Elkinas did not recognize her in a new body, trembling with fear. He only thought that in front of him was a fake copy, and this look, full of bewilderment and alienation, became for her a painful blow to the very heart, as if at that moment she lost everything. The feeling was like a blow to the chest, as if someone had taken and torn out her soul, and she, unable to cope with the growing pain, pressed her palms tighter to her heart, feeling how the pain filled her from within, as if nothing remained of her former confidence. Now, with a new appearance, she left her past behind, and it was no surprise that Elkinas did not recognize her, because the changes she had experienced were too drastic, and this realization was a heavy blow to her. Her heart sank with pain, and tears began to flow down her cheeks, one after another, like rain, carrying away everything that was once dear to her, and leaving behind only emptiness filled with bitterness and despair. The beauty, unable to contain her emotions, began to cry, wiping tears from her eyelashes. Her heart was squeezed with bitterness, because pity for the poor Duke engulfed her soul, like a heavy burden that was impossible to ignore, and she could not help but feel his suffering. Elkinas, coldly and reservedly, said that Arin was behaving like a capricious child, and he wondered what had caused her to cry so hard, which had made her so openly show her vulnerability to him. Elkinas approached angrily, his tone not hiding the mockery. He brought his face closer to the lady and with furious interest asked how much it cost to check her authenticity, because she also claimed the place of the sorceress who died many years ago, as if everything had been decided in advance. The young man was like a puppeteer, masterfully testing each woman as if they were all just pawns in his game, and his cold gaze took them all in, revealing weaknesses and secrets that they could not hide from his penetrating gaze. She felt like a doll being played with mercilessly, being tested harshly just for laughs, with every step she took turning her life into a game that had no fairness or meaning, to be thrown away like useless trash, forgotten and rejected, like a thing that no longer has value, that no longer arouses either regret or interest in those who once paid attention to it. She felt like she had been thrown into a basket with the other toys, abandoned and forgotten like her, by everyone who had once been dear to her, now left only as shadows, forgotten in a world that did not notice them. The noblewoman, unable to contain her pain, suddenly screamed, loudly declaring that she was no longer the one Elkinas was looking for, putting her hands in front of her as if trying to protect herself from his gaze, which was once full of love and hope. Elkinas, who did not remember what had happened, asked in surprise what the girl meant, because her words contradicted the scenario that he had so clearly built in his head, not expecting such a turn of events. Erin repeated again, with bitterness in her voice, that she was not his chosen one, that her place had long since lost its meaning in his life, and now she stood here to prove to herself that all this time she had been just an illusion. The man frowned, his gaze darkened with doubt, And after a short pause, he asked questioningly, who then was that mysterious beauty whose image had so unexpectedly stirred up a vague anxiety and uninvited interest in his soul? Suddenly, an image of an elf flashed in her memory, with whom she had once enthusiastically composed her new story, thinking through every detail to the smallest detail, as if it were not just a fiction, but a fragment of their shared reality, filled with magic and secret plans. Sweat was pouring down her face from excitement, but she gathered her courage and loudly and solemnly declared that she was the daughter of an elf, although her voice sounded so uncertain that even the most convincing statement would have seemed at that moment only a weak shadow of the truth. Zephyr froze in deep shock when the sorceress, without a shadow of respect and with annoying carelessness, called the sacred tree an unremarkable tree, forgetting that it was under its shadow that her mother rested, the one who was once born in their shared history. The Duke, in complete shock, tiredly ran his hand over his face, then grabbed his head tightly, as if trying to collect his thoughts, and asked in bewilderment why then, at the moment of transformation, the girl came to him, when she could have chosen another path. Earlier, Arn was going to open up to her friend, explaining that she had come to him not by chance, but with the firm intention of protecting him from danger and helping him return to the true path. But what she saw turned her thoughts upside down, and at the last moment she abandoned this idea. With a cold, almost icy detachment, Elkanas looked at her and asked why she needed to look so closely at the egg and the dragon that was soon to be born, and what was the real reason for her interest in such a secret and important moment. Zephyr, without losing his composure, helped the girl get out of the awkward situation, hastily declaring that they had not come out of curiosity, but in order to check whether a dragon would really hatch from this egg soon, and whether there was a catch in what was happening. There was a possibility that, as soon as the little dragon was born, he would become frightened and, not recognizing the Duke as his mother, would rush away, trying to escape, as if from a stranger whom he had yet to understand and accept. Zephyr, quickly assessing the situation, resolutely stood in front of the aristocrat, shielding her with his body, and, without wasting a second, deftly changed the topic of conversation, not allowing the discussion to take an undesirable turn, skillfully directing the conversation into a safe channel. The nobleman calmly, but with a degree of firmness, added that they had no intention of kidnapping the little dragon, and on the contrary, it would be much more reasonable and advantageous for the Duke himself to show the cub, thereby dispelling all doubts and strengthening trust. Elkinas listened to them without further ado, not giving the impression that the decision had already been made, and then, after a pause, nodded, confirming his agreement, and dryly ordered them to follow him, without wasting time on further discussions, making it clear that further objections were useless. The nobles, without asking any unnecessary questions, followed the owner of the house, carefully watching his confident gait, and, feeling the hidden tension, walked along the long corridor of the mansion, where each step echoed loudly in the semi-darkness of the ancient walls, reminding of the mystery. The lady realized with shock that the dragon was probably so huge that it had to be kept in a separate annex, and at the same moment the Duke calmly, but with satisfaction, announced that they had finally arrived at the place, hinting at the importance of the upcoming event. The grown men entered the room last, looking around carefully, and it was the elf and the butler who lingered at the entrance, studying the living room as if trying to catch hidden details before coming to a conclusion about what was happening, their eyes wandering around the room. The girl realized in horror that the frightening, ominous energy was not coming from a massive dragon or an ancient artifact, but from the cradle itself in which the egg rested, exuding an inexplicable power. And this eerie aura gripped her consciousness with an alarming premonition. Suddenly, as if breaking through the silence, a tiny child's hand emerged from the crib, hesitantly reaching upward, and this sight was so unexpected that it made the air in the room thicken with tense silence, filling the event with new meaning. The lady, not hiding her shock, froze, staring in a daze at the cradle, because her whole being was preparing to see a monster. But instead of a terrible monster, a baby appeared in front of her, which completely destroyed her ideas about what she expected at this fateful moment. The baby lay in the cradle, smiling happily, and with childish spontaneity stretched out his tiny hands in front of him, as if trying to grasp something invisible, filling the room with an atmosphere of innocent warmth that contrasted sharply with the expectations of the guests. Zephyr and Aaron, not hiding their surprise, looked at the baby with wide eyes, studying him with genuine interest, as if they could not fully believe that in front of them was not a terrifying monster, but a tiny, defenseless creature. The boy stood up hesitantly on his feet, holding tightly to the railings of the cradle, and this simple but touching movement caused a wave of affection in those around him, because even stern hearts could not remain indifferent to such a sincere manifestation of life. His huge, curious eyes stared at the Duke with deep seriousness, as if they reflected silent expectation, and his expression seemed like an insistent request, understandable without words, for his father to take him in his arms, giving him a feeling of warmth and protection. Aaron, watching this scene, asked the Duke if he would mind if she took the child in her arms, but he seemed to pay no attention to what was happening, indifferently answering that he didn't care. The lady picked up the baby in her arms with genuine joy. Her smile shone even brighter, and genuine admiration appeared in her eyes, because as soon as she felt the warmth of the tiny creature, she finally became convinced that this child did not cause fear, but only affection. The noblewoman could not comprehend and accept the fact that this charming baby, so defenseless and kind, was really that very monster hatched from the mysterious egg, because he seemed too cute, alive, and real. Holding the boy in her arms, she began to play with him with ease and tenderness, watching him laugh joyfully, grabbing her fingers, and she didn't even notice how she herself became carried away by this moment, completely forgetting about everything that was happening around her. Zephyr, watching this strange picture, turned to his former comrade and with a slight doubt in his voice asked a direct question whether this child was really the very monster that was spoken of, and whether there was some mistake or misunderstanding here. Elkinas, without changing his facial expression and avoiding meeting his interlocutor's gaze, nodded slowly, confirming that this was the pure truth, but his tense posture and gaze directed to the side indicated that he himself could not fully understand his thoughts and doubts. The child looked like a very ordinary baby. There was nothing of a dragon in him, no hint of animal features, no strange signs, and at that moment it seemed to those around him the biggest mystery, the answer to which remained unknown. Elkinas, frowning in irritation, sharply asked a question to which he himself did not know the answer. Why the hell did an ordinary human child emerge from an egg from which a real dragon should have hatched? And what did all this really mean? Everyone without exception knew that dragons never gave birth to people, because only lizards emerged from their eggs, which over time turned into majestic creatures, and not a single legend, not a single ancient scroll mentioned that something like this could happen. Erin, not hiding her sincere curiosity, carefully asked who this baby really was if he was not the child of a monster, and where his real parents were then, because the appearance of a man from a dragon's egg seemed impossible. Zephyr, after thinking, suggested that perhaps the baby was a half-breed, an unusual fruit of the union of two different bloods, because this sometimes happened, although it was considered an extremely rare phenomenon, encountered in the most unusual and mysterious stories. As a rule, it was the girl who fell in love with the dragon who carried his child in her womb and then gave birth to him, passing on her human essence to the baby, but without losing the dragon nature in him, which awakened over time and determined his true essence. Much less often, it happened that the dragon itself had feelings for a man, and then, obeying the ancient laws of its nature, it laid an egg, which did not appear by chance, but became the fruit of a connection with a loved one, having absorbed the power of both. However, there were much darker and more terrifying cases where an empty egg was forcibly fertilized, infusing it with alien dark energy, creating artificial life, and it was this option that sounded the most plausible. The man, shielding his girlfriend with his back, asked with cold determination if Elkinas had indeed spilled his own blood on the dragon egg, causing it to absorb the alien power and forcibly infuse it with life. They stood opposite each other, a tension hanging between them that could tear the air apart, while Zephyr, without looking away, protected the noblewoman and the child, and the Duke remained silent as a statue, not betraying a single emotion, hiding his true intentions. The aristocrat's cold eyes, devoid of any feelings, looked at his interlocutor with frightening indifference, and his face remained so calm and imperturbable that it seemed as if what was happening did not bother him at all and had no meaning for him. The terrible guess turned out to be true, and now there was no doubt that the Duke had indeed spilled his blood on the dragon's egg, and it was thanks to this that a child was born inside him, whose appearance violated all known laws of nature and magic. After this, he completed the ritual, sealing the creation with a magical seal woven from scarlet symbols that shimmered with a dark light. For its power was not his own, but granted by the dark entities that he subdued by eating the heart of a real dragon. Zephyr, not holding back his anger, pointed his finger sharply at the Duke, his voice shaking with accusation, and he loudly asked how far he was willing to go in his thirst for revenge and hatred. Had he really crossed a line that could no longer be crossed without consequences? The young maiden, full of concern, slowly extended her hand, calling upon the spirits of silence to let their soft power envelop the space, drowning out all sounds around, for she did not want the baby to be frightened or feel anxious from the tense atmosphere. Magic, like a shimmering mist, swirled around her and the child, weaving an iridescent glow from the air, and among this magical stream, tiny, glowing butterflies flared, creating a feeling of comfort and security, as if at that moment the whole world was protecting them. Holding the baby in her arms, the girl pressed him to herself, wanting him not to feel superfluous, unwanted or forgotten for a moment, because in her eyes he was as precious as any living being, deserving of love and warmth. The boy, enchanted by what was happening, laughed joyfully. His tiny hands reached out to the flickering lights, and such a sincere and pure smile shone on his face that at that moment it seemed impossible to believe in his dark origin. But suddenly, a voice broke the spell of the moment, as the Duke, without hiding his determination, stretched out his hand and pointed his finger inexorably straight at the baby, loudly declaring that he was concerned with only one single question, to which he intended to have an answer. The man, with curiosity and caution, asked the elf how long it would take for the baby dragon's magical abilities to manifest, because it was important for him to know when these powers could be used, but the baby himself did not seem to be worried about this. The maiden, looking at her imaginary father, addressed him tenderly, while Zephyr, sensing the change in the atmosphere, became wary, expecting something important when his name was spoken, as if it foreshadowed something difficult and significant. There were many strange and incredible phenomena in this world, such as the blue sky filled with magic and mysterious lights, and so the baby dragon probably needed some time to reveal the power within itself that had remained hidden until now. Arin paused and coughed into her hand, drawing the attention of those present to the fact that the child, no matter how much they wanted to interfere, should not be watched by the two of them, but by outside and more experienced eyes, in order to avoid unnecessary mistakes in the future. The Duke, chuckling discreetly and watching what was happening carefully, crossed his arms over his chest, waiting for the moment when everything would become clear, and his gaze remained wary, studying every gesture of the stranger and the reaction of the baby, as if he was looking for a hidden meaning in their actions. Meanwhile, the girl, playing with the baby, smiled, and in her gaze one could read endless tenderness, as if he were her own son, and she was absolutely indifferent to who his real parents were. She accepted him as a part of herself. The nobleman suddenly approached the noble aristocrat, offering her to take on the role of nanny for the little dragon, and his offer hung in the air like an inevitable sentence for which the girl could not prepare in any way. The lady froze in shock, not believing her ears, because she had not meant such a role at all, but it was already impossible to refuse, and her heart sank from the realization that now she had to accept an offer that she could not refuse. The noblewoman, desperately hoping for salvation, stared at the elf. A plea for help was visible in his eyes, as if he was the only one who could intervene and speak a word against. But her hopes were immediately dashed when Zephyr only sighed heavily and put his hand on his head. He was exhausted and tired, and instead of resisting, he released the tension, and holding back his irritation, said that he did not mind if the lady really decided to become a nanny, because in the current situation, it was difficult for him to object. The Duke, with a slight mockery in his voice, reminded that the elf himself, in all likelihood, would have to leave this place, leaving his daughter in the care of the aristocrat, and now only the last detail remained: the girl herself, who would take care of the child in the future. The young man's eyes flared with rage. Red sparks of hatred lit up his gaze as he declared that everything about the lady infuriated him, starting with her blood, in which elven power flowed. But no matter what happened, she was still suitable for the role of the one who could take care of the dragon. With his hands on his hips and a rude expression on his face, the man said that if Arin herself did not agree with his proposal, then the conversation with her would be over, and she could simply leave, leaving everything as it was, without trying to interfere with his plans, the girl thought, her gaze dropping downwards as she realized that this was her last chance to try to convince the guy and find a way to help him keep his mind, not allowing his emotions to take over his reason and determination. Having made a difficult choice, the beautiful noblewoman closed her eyes, as if she was going to find the strength, one last time, to make a decision that could change their future, not thinking about the consequences, but clearly feeling that the moment had come. Opening her eyes, she stared at the Duke with a determined look, full of confidence, as if showing that she was ready to do everything to save him, no matter what, and nothing could shake her decision, no matter how difficult it was. Besides, she desperately wanted this little baby with big black eyes to find happiness too, because like any child, he deserved a life filled with love and care, and not the tragic fate that awaited him. Elkinas turned away, immersed in silence, but when Arin finally stated that she agreed to his terms, he flinched as if it were an unexpected turn, and his eyes flashed with bewilderment, but also some confusion. The noblewoman firmly stated that she would remain in the mansion and look after the child, taking on this responsibility, and thereby confirming that her choice was not accidental, and she was ready to go all the way in order to correct the situation. With surprise and delight, the lady looked around her new house, where she was now to live, enjoying the beauty of the estate and its comfort, realizing that this new place had become her new home, full of opportunities and hopes. The Duke replied that she was now his dragon's nanny, but at the same time, he still did not know the girl's name, because it remained an unresolved issue that needed to be clarified soon in order to establish a final relationship. The noblewoman thought for a moment, trying to come up with a new name on the fly, because the old one no longer suited her. It no longer sounded the same as before, as if everything in her life had changed, and she could not come to terms with this new turn of events. Suddenly, she remembered a fairy tale in which there was a beautiful aristocrat in a pink fluffy dress, sitting at a table and drinking tea, and her name was Adele, which for some time brought her a feeling of comfort and calm, like in childhood. Smiling, the sweet lady introduced herself as Adele, a name that suited her perfectly at that moment, and she felt that it had now become her new identity, ready to open up new horizons of life and possibilities for her. The man repeated her name with a slight ironic tone, as if considering how it could reveal her essence, and then, restrainedly, and without unnecessary emotion, introduced himself, thereby restoring confidence in his conversation. In the depths of her soul, the lady thought with a slight mockery that the Duke probably did not understand how surprising and even proud she felt, realizing that an entire city was named after him, and how strange, but at the same time pleasant it was to realize this. The aristocrat, with a slight bow, said goodbye to her, after which, as if it were a familiar ritual, he ordered her to rest before the upcoming work, realizing that rest was now necessary for her to prepare for new responsibility. When the lady was about to retire, the butler approached her, asking with respect in his voice if he could ask her one important question for him, which had been bothering him for a long time and required resolution before he could continue his duties. The lady froze with a forced smile when her deception was revealed, and Zephyr was told that he was clearly not her father, which was an unexpected blow to her, because she thought she had hidden it well enough, but it turned out otherwise. The girl froze in horror, realizing that her lie had been exposed just one day later, and that now all her attempts to justify herself had lost all meaning. leaving only empty words that could not hide the bitter truth. Erin desperately began to look for excuses, trying to hastily invent a story about her life that could somehow explain her strange behavior. But the words did not come, and she felt how the lie was swallowing her deeper and deeper, draining her of her last strength. Previously, the elf had addressed her as a sorceress, a title that had always been associated exclusively with his former friend, and this turned out to be the small but decisive element that exposed her deception, dispelling all illusions. The butler, who had been watching the proceedings closely, said that her story was interesting, but he did not believe it at all, feeling that something was wrong and that she was trying to hide the truth, making him doubt her intentions. The noblewoman felt deep down in her soul how her heart was breaking with pain, but on the outside, she continued to smile, trying not to show her feelings, and, as if by inertia, continued to maintain a light, casual conversation, hiding her true emotions. The servant nodded in response. His face remained impassive, and his eyes hid complete distrust, because he did not believe a single word of the lady, feeling that her story was only an attempt to hide the truth that he felt, but could not prove. The lady, feeling an inner uneasiness, clutched the fabric of the hem of her dress in her hands, her fingers nervously fingering the material as her thoughts became confused, and she tried to maintain her composure despite the fear that was squeezing her chest. With her hands folded in a prayerful gesture, she looked imploringly at the butler, forgetting her pride for a moment, and with a soft but confident voice, asked him not to divulge her secret and not to tell the Duke about her true nickname, hoping for his silent consent. When the beauty appeared in the mansion, her presence seemed to fill the air with magical energy, which emanated from her with such force that the feeling was almost tangible, as if she herself was the source of incredible power. It resembled something similar to the Tree of Life, worldly and powerful, radiating the same incomprehensible power as magic, capable of influencing the entire world, filling it with energy as bright and endless. So the butler was deeply impressed when he met her. His eyes widened in surprise, unable to hide his admiration and confusion, because this woman clearly possessed something unusually powerful and mysterious. The girl, feeling the inner strength, understood that her body, received from the tree, retained this power, which she could feel at the level of her soul, and now her nature was connected with this mysterious force, which began to reveal its facets. The man, carefully placing his hand on the door handle to open the door, looked at her silently, as if thinking about something important, and then with a slight bow said goodbye to the lady, saying that it was time for him to go, and left her in this mysterious atmosphere. He said goodbye to the lady. The words he had spoken dissolved in the air like the last chords of music, and said that it was time to go, leaving her in the thick shadow of his thoughts, like an empty room in which his invisible shadow could be felt for a long time. The lady, slightly at a loss, opened her mouth in surprise when the man asked her to take care of the Duke and the dragon child, and a sense of responsibility suddenly ignited in her soul, and her thoughts began to rapidly become confused. The door slammed behind him with a loud sound, as if locking away all the stormy emotions, leaving only the echo of his footsteps, which gradually dissolved into silence, like the last note of a forgotten melody disappearing into the darkness. While Erin, absorbed in her own thoughts, tried to comprehend what was happening, she was suddenly pulled out of her thoughts by the elf's voice, which again reminded her of itself, awakening a feeling of anxiety in her and forcing her to return to reality. In shock and bewilderment, the girl turned sharply to the man, completely forgetting that he was standing right behind her, and for a moment her gaze froze, as if time had suddenly stopped, forcing her to realize the full reality of what was happening around her. Left alone, they began to argue. The guy did not take her side, which only increased Erin's anger, because she was sure that he should have supported her. But for the guy, there was no problem, and he remained adamant. Angry and irritated, they argued loudly, standing opposite each other, their faces so close that every word, every glance, felt like a blow penetrating the very soul, leaving no room for understanding or even a hint of compromise. Tired of long screams and mutual accusations, they finally collapsed helplessly on the sofas, deciding that they needed to forget about everything for at least a few minutes in order to relax and try to regain at least a bit of the inner peace that they had lost. The lady could not help but agree that, despite all the misfortunes, it was still good that they remained alive, because in such conditions, even the slightest mistake could lead to tragic consequences, and this instilled at least some relief in her heart. But she could not escape the realization that the Duke was a man capable of calmly killing without the slightest hesitation, without blinking an eye, and his cruelty was like a threat that hung over his every word and action, leaving only a shadow of fear. Zephyr, sitting in a chair and thoughtfully crossing his arms, seemed to be thinking about how he had previously considered the lady naive and stupid, believing that she could somehow influence his decisions and even try to change the course of events, which for him was a complete illusion. Closing her eyes and wearily pressing her hand to her face, she quietly muttered to herself that she had been wrong in her judgments about the Duke, realizing her naivety and wrongness, and this feeling weighed down her soul, not allowing her to get rid of the bitterness of regret. Back then, the lady had genuinely wanted to save him, but unfortunately, her actions had the exact opposite effect, and instead of saving him, she ended up only driving him mad, not realizing the consequences of her actions. Now, lying on the couch and thinking about the future, she could not get rid of the feeling of guilt, blaming herself for everything that happened, feeling how heavy memories fell upon her with each new realization. Zephyr stood up silently, his gaze becoming serious as he was sensitive to his friend's words, understanding how hard it was for her to go through everything that had happened and how important it was for her to feel support in this difficult moment. Understandingly, he covered the lady's palm with his own, trying to let her know that he was there, ready to support and help, even if not a single word could completely comfort her and ease the mental pain that tormented her. With a gentle smile on his face, he reminded her that thanks to her sacrifice and determination, all of their team members had survived, and she was now their heroine, deserving of their gratitude and respect despite everything that had happened. Sitting down next to her, the man gently added that few people would be able to do such a thing, sacrificing their lives for others, and despite all this horror, he understood how selfless she was in her desire to help. The lady watched her interlocutor attentively, listening to his every word, trying to feel sincerity in them, because despite everything that had happened, she was looking for consolation in his speech and confirmation that her actions had not been in vain. Zephyr, with full confidence, suddenly concluded that in the end the girl saved the Duke, even if he went crazy. But most likely it was because of longing for her, because her sacrifice was the spark that still kept him afloat. Through her tears, feeling grateful to the elf for his kind words, which somehow subtly encouraged her, giving her the strength to cope with the pain and feel at least a drop of hope for the future. Standing up with determination, the Virgo firmly stated that it was time to look forward rather than dwell in the past, and that her future steps would be aimed at creating new opportunities and changes that would change her life. The handsome Zephyr smiled understandingly, watching the lady carefully, and, gaining enthusiasm, asked what she was going to do next, interested in her plans and how the sweet noblewoman would act in the future. The lady did not hesitate to firmly state that her first step was to look after the Duke's child, as there was a strange energy coming from the dragon's magic in the room, and she could not ignore this premonition. There was a strange negative force in the air, like an unknown shadow, evil and hostile, which, like an ominous foggy veil, surrounded the space, causing the heart to shrink with anxiety and fear. Taking the child in her arms, Erin was surprised not to feel the slightest trace of evil or negative energy in him, although, frankly speaking, she expected to feel some kind of danger, because the dragon was not an ordinary creature at all. The nobleman, despite his knowledge of the baby's powers, for some reason decided to ignore this fact, without specifying any details, which left Erin in the dark and caused her slight bewilderment. Zephyr, sitting down in a chair, realizing the gravity of the situation, said that it seemed that Erin had decided to stay close to the child to really study him and learn more about his unusual abilities that required attention. The lady, slightly squeezing her fingers on the fabric of her dress, could not hide her excitement. Anxiety and worry from the fact that she was about to play a responsible role in the fate of this dragon lay like a heavy burden on her soul, not allowing her to relax. However, Gathering her strength and deciding not to give in to her emotions, Arin looked up. Her face expressed firmness, and she, overcoming her doubts, resolutely said that she would put an end to all this and complete her mission to the end. Not understanding, the elf curiously asked what exactly the maiden meant by the word end. His arms folded across his chest and his gaze fixed on her, waiting for a clear explanation that could clarify her intentions. The lady, with a hint of determination in her voice, explained that her goal was to restore the Duke's ability to feel emotions again, so that he could once again enjoy life, laugh, and find the strength to move on. She added that she intended to find him a lover with whom he could join hands to spend a long and happy life together, giving himself a chance at the true happiness he had long dreamed of. Zephyr, stunned by her words, turned to the lady in amazement, his arms involuntarily opening, and his thoughts were mixed up. Could it be that she finally realized that the nobleman was actually in love with her, and she could be the one who would give him a chance at love? But, as if not noticing the obvious, the beauty carelessly stated that the Duke probably only felt affection for her, without attaching any particular importance to these feelings, and there was not even a hint of awareness of anything more in her voice. Exhaling tiredly, Zephyr could not restrain himself and directly stated that he was painfully tired of this endless naivety of his interlocutor, because she still had not guessed about the nobleman's true feelings, which had long been lying on the surface in front of her. The handsome man, in his usual style, resembled a bomb with a blown fuse. He could explode at any second, and his patience was gradually approaching a dangerous point, beyond which there was no room for calm. Covering her mouth with her hand in surprise, the noblewoman said in confusion, "Did Zephyr really think that the Duke could like her? Because that simply could not be, and this thought seemed absolutely impossible and even absurd to her. In the past, she clearly remembered how in her previous life, a man, when he was near her, constantly looked around, as if mentally looking for an opportunity to escape, which then seemed to her a sign of his obvious unwillingness to be near. The elf, clutching his head, sighed heavily, completely unable to understand how such an incredibly stupid young lady could attract the attention of a nobleman, because her naivety and blindness to the obvious went far beyond the bounds of common sense. The lady, grabbing her hair and pulling it in different directions, suddenly realized that perhaps Elkanas had been weaving a cunning trap around her all this time, in order to eventually lure her into a trap and get rid of her once and for all. The elf, tilting his head to one side, looked closely at the sorceress, and, trying to speak as calmly as possible, assured her in a soft but firm voice that Elkinas had never intended to harm her, and that all her guesses were merely the fruit of fatigue and fear. With her hands stretched out in front of her in confusion, as if trying to feel for answers in the void, the lady looked attentively at the young man. Her gaze was full of hope and confusion, because only he could now dispel her fears, shed light on the doubts tormenting her. Outside the window, the evening was rapidly thickening, enveloping the city in a veil of mysterious twilight, and in the bedroom, a quiet thoughtfulness reigned, broken only by the slight swaying of the curtains. The soft, silvery light of the moon broke through the glass, falling in pale stripes. The noblewoman woke up with the first rays of dawn, slowly stretching her arms upward, but the room was still in semi-darkness, because the heavy curtains remained tightly closed, not allowing daylight to penetrate inside, leaving a feeling of night comfort and slight detachment. Leaning on her bent arm, she stared thoughtfully at the empty wall, her thoughts wandering far away, wondering where Zephyr could be now and what he was thinking. Remembering their conversation yesterday, which still haunted her, she suddenly remembered with warmth her closest friends, with whom she had been connected through years of trials and hardships. Chania, having gone through many obstacles, managed to lead the church and gained the status of a saint, revered by the people for her wisdom and mercy. Jamil, with her unbending will and outstanding abilities, managed to gain enormous authority in the criminal world, where the weak are not forgiven. Her name inspired fear in her enemies, and her strength of character allowed her to remain unshakable in the face of danger. Zephyr then told her something amazing. Despite all the complexity of their fates, both girls managed to leave behind valuable notes in which they described in detail their lives, thoughts, and memories of their dear friend, whose path was cut short so tragically. Before her death, Chania decided to reveal to him one important secret, carefully hidden for many years. She told him something truly unusual concerning her memoirs, which, perhaps, contained the answers to the main questions of their past. All the memories that she carefully kept in her heart were written down in a confession book, which became not only a testimony of her life's journey, but also the last message she left to the world after she passed away. Jamil's book was probably found after her death, and soon fell into the hands of those who, without thinking about the possible consequences, took it, hoping to uncover her secrets, to hear her voice and learn her deepest thoughts through the pages of this personal confession. Apparently, the imperial family took advantage of these records, sending a spy to the Duke in order to deceive him into believing that his beloved could return from the dead and emerge from the grave, resurrected miraculously. The Virgin noted that Jamil had been unusually wise to sell her journals, leaving behind a legacy that could influence events by living on in the memories of those who knew her story and her deepest thoughts. Chania always behaved modestly and sweetly, and when she walked with the sorceress, they happily chatted on various topics, discussing everything that came to mind, enjoying the time spent together. The Holy Virgin, fondly recalling her childhood, admitted that even in her early years, while at the temple, she learned all the prayers, and this knowledge became an important foundation for her spiritual path, strengthening her faith for many years to come. The sorceress, smiling in response, admitted that she had acquired a lot thanks to her mother, who not only passed on her knowledge and skills, but also became an important mentor for her, an example to which she always aspired. Chania laughed, calling her friend charming and truly kind, noting how her endless kindness and thoughtfulness illuminates the world around her, filling the hearts of everyone around her with light and warmth. Aaron couldn't help but turn to her with a smile and softly say that it seemed like they had managed to discuss all possible topics because their conversation had no limits, and every spoken word became a new field for deep thoughts and ideas. Then night fell, and their loud voices echoed across the dark sky like exclamations directed at the stars, filling everything around with living energy and causing the silence of the night to dissipate under their influence. In response, Aaron's gaze became thoughtful, as she wondered if Chania was going to have tea with the Duke, since every time they communicated, it was so sweet and sincere that it brought joy to both parties. In the distance, they noticed two figures, almost dissolving in the night shadows. These were Elkinas and Jamil, who were moving side by side, as if merging into one whole, filled with quiet harmony and inexpressible closeness. The sorceress looked for a long time at her comrades, at this couple who looked as if they were absorbed in mutual love, and suddenly she felt a strange uneasiness in her soul, from which she became uncomfortable. Now, sitting by the window in the present, Erin wondered what she had actually felt then. Perhaps it was envy or jealousy, feelings that seemed to appear completely unexpectedly and torment her deeply. Suddenly, feeling alarmed, she stood up from her seat and noticed something strange. A chain of dark energy, like invisible hands, was crawling along the ground, foreshadowing something ominous and terrible, ready to unfold at any moment. The city looked frozen, as if time had stopped, and the sky was covered in a crimson color, reminding that it was soaked in blood, creating an atmosphere of inevitable fear and horror that engulfed everything around, as if the world was ready to disappear. The girl turned around and realized that the dark energy was already penetrating her room, spreading like a black stream, filling every corner and absorbing the space with ominous magic that increasingly surrounded her. Realizing that it was too late to run, the sorceress decided to use her magic, clasping her hands in front of her, commanding the spirit to appear so that it could help her deal with the growing shadow that threatened her life. In response to her call, a green wave of magic appeared, which began to swirl in the air, filling the space with light and energy. And soon, a spirit appeared before her, whose name was Eri, a being trapped in a powerful spell, ready to carry out her will. The ghost greeted his mistress, noting with mild surprise that she had once again used the seal that was the key to his power to summon him. It was a sign of her determination and ability to summon him when she wished. The spirit expressed displeasure, reminding him that he should have been summoned exclusively through an official contract. But Aaron, without going into details, interrupted him, stating that another urgent matter was more important now, requiring her immediate intervention. Suddenly, the lady leaped from the window, as if devoid of fear, and like a bird, swooped down from a height, ordering the ghost to catch her and take her to the east wing of the building, where an important and urgent matter was already awaiting her. The ghost, fulfilling her will, deftly held the lady in his arms, flying through the air, and at the same time muttered that, despite the changed body, the recklessness of her actions remained the same, without losing its fury. They soon arrived at another wing of the mansion, where there was a thick darkness, and the noblewoman could barely see where to go, feeling the dark forces gathering around her, as if the space itself was shrouded in evil. It was a kind of dark gnat that merged into a single whole, like a strong stream, absorbing everything in its path and becoming dangerous, like a single organism, generating evil in its every movement. Aaron smiled as she met the one she had been looking for many days, and her face was filled with a bright light of joy, as if she had finally met her long-awaited companion who had returned after an endless wait. There, in the cradle, lay a baby named Rinty, and, noticing his new nanny, his face lit up with genuine joy and a trusting gleam, as if he recognized her at once, despite his young age. With relief and joy, the girl lifted the baby into her arms, feeling her heart fill with warm calm, because she was sure that everything was okay with him, ready to carefully take care of him in this important and dark moment. The noble lady rocked the baby tenderly in her arms until his breathing became measured and calm, and then, frowning, she lifted with her fingers the barely visible remains of the traces left by the demon, who, hiding in the night, left behind only a glimmer of evil. The woman looked thoughtfully at the parchment in her hand, her gaze becoming more and more intense, and at that moment, she suddenly clearly realized that someone whose intentions were far from good had chosen Rinty as their target. The little child looked at his nanny with surprise and slight fear, not understanding why her usually kind and warm eyes were suddenly filled with anxiety, and her hands, which always hugged him tenderly, were now trembling, as if she had just learned something terrible. The thin, slightly crumpled piece of paper was tightly clutched in her fingers, as if it were the last thread connecting her to the truth, and the more she peered at the text that appeared, the more clearly she understood that this piece of paper carried something much more important. Suddenly, the air around noticeably heated up, the space shook, and against its background, the fiery symbols of an ancient magical seal flared up with frightening clarity, as if the flame itself, obeying the will of an invisible master, awakened forbidden forces. Aaron, holding the child in her arms, concentratedly cast a spell, and at that very moment, the air around her trembled with magical power, and a determined gleam flashed in her eyes, because she was going to call upon an ancient spirit to whom she could turn only at the most important moment. A fiery ghost emerged from the opening fiery rift, its silhouette trembling with heat, and its gaze full of arrogant interest, and as soon as it appeared before the sorceress, it grinned and brazenly asked why she dared to disturb his peace again. The sorceress and the Fire Lord exchanged glances that suggested something more than a simple meeting between a spellcaster and a spirit, for they were connected by a past filled with events that made them allies. The fire spirit laughed, his voice sounding like the rumble of a distant thunderstorm, and, stretching his lips into a grin, he noted with disdain that the time without her did not weigh heavily on him, because he got along well with those small creatures that people, not without a bit of fear, called spirits of flame. The noble lady, smiling reservedly, explained to the summoned spirit that the child in her arms was not her own at all, and that she was merely acting as his nanny, but it was this baby that became the reason why she again decided to turn to the ancient Lord of Fire. Finally, the lady, throwing aside unnecessary words, resolutely raised her hand up. Her fingers flashed with magical energy for a moment, and, looking the spirit straight in the eyes, she, with unshakable confidence, offered him to once again conclude a magical contract with her, as many years ago. The lady only smiled softly when the Lord of Flame, without even thinking, agreed to her proposal, because he was thirsty for the strength and power that the sorceress could bestow upon him, and a greedy spark of anticipation was already flaring up in his blazing eyes. The fire ghost, his fiery eyes flashing, spoke, declaring that he was ready to make a deal with her, because in her magic he felt the power that could kindle his flame even brighter, and therefore the desire to negotiate was as natural to him as the fire itself, hungry to burn. However, before sealing the magical union, he wanted to know the true name of the one with whom he was concluding the contract, because the name had power, and to know it meant to gain power, and the girl at that moment sat calmly in the center of the circle, allowing the flame to reflect in her eyes. The beauty smiled mysteriously. Her voice sounded firm and confident when she said not a fictitious name behind which one could hide, but her real one, endowed with magic and destiny. She called herself Arin, leaving no doubt about her strength. As soon as the deal was concluded, hot tongues of flame burst from the seal, swirled around the room, soaring to the ceiling, and the noble lady, closing her eyes, instinctively pressed the child to her chest, protecting him from the raging magic, feeling how a new destiny was flaring up around her. The happy Fire King literally beamed with joy, because for the first time in many years, he felt such a bright and pure energy emanating from his new mistress, and this unexpected gift filled him with strength, causing the flames around him to flare up even brighter in response. The spirit noted with respect that Arin was the only sorceress in the world who had managed to make a contract with him for the second time, and this made her unique among all the spellcasters, because not everyone could win the trust of such a powerful being. Erin laughed loudly, her smile warm and genuine, and with a slight bow of her head, she thanked the spirit with gratitude for his strength and trust, well aware of what a rare honor it was for a mage to have twice allied with the fiery lord. The spirit, folding his hands on his hips, quickly realized that he had been called here for a reason, but so that he could drive out the evil that lurked in this place, and, looking at the hostess with a sly grin, he simply shook his head, anticipating her true intentions. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, Arin noticed something in the corner of the room, and her heart sank. There, unconscious, lay the maid, who, apparently, had recently been attacked by evil forces, leaving her body helplessly sprawled on the cold floor. Without wasting any time, the sorceress knelt down next to the victim, carefully touching her wrist to check her pulse, and, looking into her face, tried to understand whether the poor girl was still alive, and whether there was a way to save her from this dark misfortune. She carefully checked the servant's pulse, and to her relief, she found that she was fine, just unconscious, but no signs of serious injury, which meant that the girl would soon come to her senses if given a little time. Soon, their gaze fell upon a sacred, incredibly ancient sword, shrouded in an aura of mysterious power, which once belonged to a great warrior whose exploits had long since become a legend, and now this weapon, as if forgotten by time, was once again waiting for the one who could lift it. The weapon, oddly enough, ended up in the hands of the Duke, who suddenly appeared in the room, his chest heaving, his face covered in sweat, as if he had just fled or experienced something that had knocked him out of his usual composure. With his head down and his fingers clenched around the hilt of his sword, the nobleman looked sternly at the girl, his voice sounding firm and demanding as he asked what exactly the lady was doing in this place at such a late hour, and what excuse she could have for such a strange visit. Erin felt her insides tighten. She tried to justify herself, but realizing that none of the hastily invented explanations sounded convincing enough, she hesitated, and then, taking a deep breath, decided to start her speech again. Clutching her head, the sorceress sighed heavily, realizing that she needed to speak carefully, and promised that she would explain everything before the Duke had time to get completely angry, because discontent and suspicion were already visible in his gaze. The baby at this time was sleeping quietly and peacefully in his cradle, absorbed in the fatigue that had accumulated during the day and the peace of the night, unaware of the events that were happening around him and how they could affect his peace. The baby was sleeping peacefully in his cradle at this time, his little body absorbed by the fatigue accumulated during the day and the silence of the night, while events were unfolding around him that could have disturbed his peaceful sleep. The maiden replied that she was fine, but deep down she felt relieved. Perhaps the Duke had really changed his attitude towards her, stepping back from his anger and showing mercy, which unexpectedly sounded to her like some kind of favor. However, the beautiful girl was shocked to hear that the nobleman demanded a report from her the very next morning, literally at breakfast, and this turn of events left her in a state of confusion, not understanding how she could prepare for such an important conversation so quickly. Returning to her room, the maiden walked slowly and tiredly, each step giving her difficulty, as if the events that were happening around her had left a heavy mark on her soul, which she could not immediately understand and comprehend. She was exhausted, and despite her fatigue, she laughed sadly, thinking that tomorrow she would have to face again that same old friend who had once been close, but now seemed to have gone mad. A new day had dawned, and although she still remained tired and gloomy, her new green dress and the jewel sparkling on her neck gave her a certain noble beauty, as if hiding the weight of her inner experiences. The noblewoman said goodbye to herself in her mind, feeling an emptiness in her heart, and wishing that there was an elf next to her, whose presence could at least slightly brighten up her loneliness. While she was heading towards the dining room, this quiet and unspoken request arose in her chest. They soon arrived at the right place in the palace, and the nobleman, slowly and confidently holding the door handle, announced their arrival, giving a subtle but clear sign that she could enter and continue her way inside without disturbing the tranquility of the moment. Was already waiting in the room. His presence was majestic. He greeted her calmly, his voice sounded even, and without unnecessary haste, and then ordered her to sit at the table, indicating that this was where she was supposed to be. The girl, without hesitation, approached the place indicated by the men, realizing that she had not the slightest right to refuse. His words sounded to her like an immutable law, and she followed his every instruction with unconditional obedience and respect. The large table, filled with a variety of exquisite delicacies, looked luxurious, and, as if not noticing the tension in the air, Elkinus wished her bon appetit. And so began their meal, full of silence and a tense atmosphere. There were many dishes on the table: shrimp, salads, meat, vegetables. All of them created an exquisite variety of tastes and colors, attracting attention and promising an unforgettable gastronomic pleasure. A delicious roast with meat, potatoes, tomatoes, and herbs, the aroma of which was so enticing that it was difficult to resist, filled the room with an amazing smell, making you feel how your appetite awakens with every breath. The girl, licking the spoon, with obvious pleasure, enjoyed every piece of food, which was truly delicious, and could not hide her delight, feeling how exquisitely and deliciously everything that was offered to her was prepared. Elkinus noticed that the lady certainly liked the food, and, observing her reaction, he could not resist asking, wondering how she actually liked it, since he was interested in her opinion about this dish. Arin quietly noted that she liked everything, and the food was simply magnificent, admiring her taste and the skill of the chef, who was able to create such amazing dishes that she could not remain indifferent. However, after saying one of the phrases that reminded her of her past, she suddenly froze, feeling her heart squeeze with fear. Perhaps she accidentally revealed her true identity to the Duke, which could bring her into considerable trouble. Terrified at the thought that she might have given herself away, Arin felt tears begin to well up in her eyes, unable to hide her emotions, as she felt like she had exposed herself over something as seemingly simple as food, and it could have serious consequences. Noticing that the guest had stopped eating, the man asked in bewilderment what had happened to her, because she had clearly become tense, as if something was bothering her, and his gaze was full of concern, not understanding what could have caused such a change in her behavior. Changing the subject, Elkinas curiously asked how things were going with the report he had instructed her to prepare for breakfast, asking whether it was ready yet and whether it could be expected any time soon, since it was important for him to know whether everything was under control. After listening to the lady's story, the Duke agreed that it was entirely possible that a high-level demon with clearly bad intentions had actually visited the day before, which could have affected her condition. Evil thoughts and alien hands reached out to the child, trembling, not hiding their sinister intentions that did not promise anything good. Their energy was filled with evil and despair, like darkness, ready to swallow an innocent soul. The young man asked curiously why the beauty had not asked why he had not gotten rid of the demonic creatures that night, since everything could have ended completely differently, and his gaze showed deep bewilderment. The noblewoman calmly noted that this was exactly what she wanted to ask him about now, since the constant demonic energy had a serious effect on the child, and it was difficult to ignore despite her composure. The young man coldly replied that all his attempts were useless, and no matter how much he cleared the room, the monster's magic invariably returned, as if the darkness itself refused to leave, not acknowledging even his strongest efforts. The lady froze in shock, unable to comprehend what was happening. Her gaze, filled with fear and anxiety for the baby dragon, revealed the whole storm of emotions tormenting her from within, and anxiety did not give her peace. She was deeply upset and could not believe that such a powerful man as the Duke could not clear the room of darkness, because his power, in her opinion, should have been able to cope with any evil, even that which seemed insurmountable. Elkenese, with a clear hint of weariness in his voice, stated that at the moment they could not count on the help of the temple or the imperial family, and for this reason it was he who was entrusted to look after the baby, protect him, and take care of his safety. The girl, carefully observing the expression on her interlocutor's face, noticed that his face was filled with sadness, and cautiously said that it was probably really hard for him to carry such a heavy and important responsibility on his shoulders. Calling himself the protector of the monster's egg, the man became public enemy number one for the entire world, as his actions caused a terrible resonance, and now he was the object of hatred and threats from those who considered him a threat to all of humanity. Death followed him relentlessly, as all who learned of his existence sought to destroy him, perceiving him as a mortal threat to the world, and not forgiving those actions that brought him the hatred and hostility of the entire society. The beauty leaned back in her chair and suddenly changed the subject, causing the Duke to watch her movements with interest and slight surprise, feeling that the conversation had suddenly changed its direction and become much more intriguing. Elkanas agreed that he carried a heavy burden on his shoulders. However, no matter how difficult it was, he could not change anything, and therefore was ready to destroy his enemies as soon as they appeared, regardless of the consequences. His eyes were ablaze with rage, scarlet as fire, as he asked his interlocutor in a tight voice if she knew anything about the mad fanatics who were hunting the monster's child, and if the world was ready to face their threat. The noblewoman, with slight surprise, asked again whether by fanatics he meant those people who believe in the devil, not fully realizing what a dangerous threat she was facing, and trying to understand what exactly he was talking about. The boy's dark eyes grew even darker as he corrected her, clarifying that she was not talking about the devil, but about a demonic creature, a dragon, whose worshippers were not just fanatics, but a real threat, capable of destroying everything in its path. The lady, stunned by what she heard, froze in place, her face distorted with fear and bewilderment, as if she could not believe that there were such people in the world who were ready to worship dark forces and serve evil, without realizing the full threat. Erin felt great pain when she learned that there had already been several attempts on her baby's life, and this news literally overwhelmed her with anxiety and worry, leaving her almost without strength. It was so hard on her soul. The woman's fingers clenched tightly on the table, her hands tensed, conveying not only anger, but also deep anxiety for the baby, whose life was now under threat, giving no peace to either her or those around her, filling everything around with tension. As soon as the girl could not restrain herself, putting her hand to her chest, she promised with full determination that she would definitely help the Duke save the dragon child, despite all the difficulties and dangers that could be encountered on her way, full of confidence in her abilities. The young man was stunned by her words, his eyes wide with surprise and disbelief, as if he couldn't believe that this fragile yet determined girl was willing to take on such an important task, because in his eyes her words seemed almost unbelievable. At that moment, it seemed to him that his old friend, who had once left this world, the sweet and strong Arin, had returned to him again. She was nearby, and despite her disappearance, he felt her presence, as if she supported him in this difficult moment. The handsome figure of the Duke stood frozen at the table, plunging him into deep thought. He was silent, unable to move, and his inner world seemed to freeze for a moment. Everything around him seemed to disappear, leaving him alone with his thoughts and experiences. The lady noticed that the Duke did not move, and feeling uneasy, she asked him cautiously if he was all right, for his silence and immobility were clearly not characteristic of him, and she could not help but feel that something was wrong. The young man, having come to his senses, asked with a cold expression on his face if his interlocutor thought that he was no better than those crazy fanatics. A scarlet rage blazed in his eyes, reflecting his deep inner disappointment and rage. The noblewoman turned to the nobleman in surprise, not understanding what exactly he was talking about. Her eyes were full of bewilderment, and she could not understand what was behind his words, as if the world around her had become incomprehensible for a moment. It was explained that the baby dragon was created by the Duke when he spilled his blood on the egg, forcing it to open despite all the consequences, and this became an unexpected turn in his life and the child's destiny. Aaron, however, found a justification for his actions and said that he probably did so because of his despair and pain in his heart, trying to find a way out of his suffering and not seeing any other options. The handsome man listened silently to the words of his interlocutor. His interest was obvious, but his face remained impassive, and despite his inner excitement, he did not allow himself to show emotions, remaining hidden and focused on the conversation. Despite his personal selfish goals, the aristocrat still continued to care for the boy as if he were his own child, showing at that moment a strange and uncharacteristic gentleness and attention. The Duke nodded and loudly declared that from now on he would listen to the lady's advice, and that she could come to him at any time with suggestions or comments, giving her the opportunity to influence important decisions. The lady was shocked. Her eyes widened in surprise as she opened her mouth, unable to hide her shock, because before she was sure that Elkanas would be angry with her and would not want to listen, and now his words sounded like a real promise of trust and respect. Suddenly, a man's hand lay on her woman's. This gesture concealed affection and care, filling the moment with unexpected warmth, which, like all his other actions, made her feel confusion and a strange, unknown tenderness. The man seemed to want to ask something of his companion sitting next to him, but suddenly he hesitated. His thoughts were in a turmoil, and he did not know how to continue the conversation, lost in search of the right words to express his feelings or doubts. However, at that moment, their conversation was interrupted by the butler, who announced that he had managed to find the place where the fanatics were conducting their sinister summoning ritual, and his voice sounded with alarm, immediately attracting the attention of everyone in the room. Elkinas, upon hearing this news, instantly jumped up from his seat. His face took on a determined and unwavering look, and he confidently declared that he would immediately go there to deal with the threat, without putting it off for later. Aaron, without thinking, immediately wanted to follow him, but the nobleman, noticing her intentions, stopped her, insistently asking her to come later and practice purification magic after the cleaning of this place was completed. The Duke smiled slyly, and looking at his companion with a slight expression of amusement, added that they would certainly meet again in the evening, promising that she would definitely find out what would happen next. The butler led the noblewoman down the corridor, leisurely making small talk, asking if she had enjoyed her breakfast, trying to create an atmosphere of calm and comfort in her company as they moved towards her chambers. As they walked, the servants began to tell of the rituals of the fanatics, explaining how they usually found dead animals and then used their blood to draw ominous seals, creating their rituals to summon dark creatures, which only increased the anxiety in her heart. Aaron, upset and outraged, angrily said that it was absolutely inhumane to cause pain and suffering to innocent beings, doing these horrible actions for unclear purposes, which further increased her feeling of anger. She then expressed her concerns to the butler, asking him why they sent the Duke alone to such a dangerous and dark place where his life could be in danger, which made her heart skip a beat. The servant smiled, noting that the noblewoman had a kind heart, since she was so worried about their master, showing sincere concern for the baby, which left a pleasant impression of her philanthropy. Indeed, the man had previously said that he was the only one taking care of the baby, since the church and the imperial family, in his opinion, were useless and could not give due attention to the child, which emphasized his loneliness in this struggle. Suddenly, the butler, bowing deeply, with sincere respect, wished the lady a good rest, and then they said goodbye, each going about their own business, leaving behind an atmosphere of politeness, peace, and mutual respect. However, Carlot remained where he was, his eyes still following the noblewoman, for it appeared that she had something important to communicate. This immediately attracted his attention and aroused his curiosity, making him wait for further words. She folded her hands in front of her, slightly bowed her head, and addressed the man in a reserved manner, quietly asking if it was possible to perform a ritual of complete purification of the entire mansion using magic, hoping that her request would be understood and fulfilled. Carlotte, smiling, easily agreed that she could very well use magic for purification, and promised that later he would definitely take her around the entire mansion, showing all its secret corners and features. The man, wiping sweat from his face, announced with slight excitement that very soon an important guest from the imperial family would arrive at his house, which of course promised big changes in their usual life. The noblewoman, hearing this news, became thoughtful, trying to understand which of the high-ranking officials could become their new visitor, and what consequences this unexpected event would bring. At that moment, a new maid, young and charming Ali, approached the lady with a sincere and kind smile on her face, offering to give her a tour of the mansion, trying to make a good impression and make her stay here more comfortable. The noblewoman, quickly noticing the servant's sincere desire to help her and show concern, accepted her offer with a grateful smile, changing into her new blue dress, which flowed in light folds over her figure, emphasizing her grace. In her hands rested a jug of water intended for cleaning, and with every step she took along the long corridors, her curiosity only grew, because this mansion kept many mysteries and secrets, each of which attracted her more and more. But when the maid suddenly started talking about the deceitful women who tried to gain their master's trust, her voice suddenly changed, becoming cold and hard, filled with genuine contempt, as if the mere mention of them caused anger. The entire city knew very well how important Lady Arryn was to their duke, and so no one tolerated liars who pretended to be her, hoping to gain his favor, which caused only contempt and sincere hatred in everyone. Meanwhile, as they slowly walked along the long corridors of the mansion, the maid suddenly started talking about an ancient prophecy that had been troubling the minds of the nobility for many years, like a harbinger of something inevitable. Ali snorted in annoyance as she noticed that the damned imperial family had once again sent their hated fortune-teller princess, whose words she had never believed, considering her nothing more than a wily schemer, weaving dangerous webs of lies. As if coming to her senses from her own outburst, the maid quickly lowered her head and, with anxiety in her voice, asked her mistress not to be angry for such insolent words, and most importantly, not to reveal her insolence to the imperial family, fearing the possible consequences. However, Arryn only smiled softly, making it clear that she understood her feelings perfectly, and, in order to calm the girl down, she gently placed her hand on her shoulder, assuring her that she did not intend to punish or betray anyone. In response, the noblewoman only asked the maid with mild interest to tell her more about this haughty princess fortune-teller, about whom there were so many rumors, because they said that she was an incredible beauty with luxurious black curls. The name of this mysterious beauty, whose image was shrouded in secrets and rumors, sounded like Eugelion de Denbine, and she became famous for the fact that, despite the years, she never married, but, nevertheless, managed to maintain her high status, youth, and striking beauty. Intrigued by this, Arryn, with slight distrust and hidden curiosity, asked the maid whether that princess really had the gift of foresight and could give people true prophecies, or whether all of this was nothing more than a beautiful legend. And indeed, 80 years ago, when a terrible drought had struck the country and people were beginning to lose all hope, this woman dared to publicly declare that nature itself had turned to her and revealed the truth to her. The noblewoman, hearing these words, thought, lightly touching her chin with her fingers, and hundreds of thoughts began to spin in her head, because such a prophecy not only seemed strange, but also made her wonder how her name could have sounded in the past. The maid, approaching her mistress and casting a glance in which genuine irritation could be read, quietly but firmly noted that she did not like the princess at all because of her strange predictions, which many blindly believed. Erin, hearing these unexpected words, felt her cheeks flush and her heart skip a beat for a moment, because the confession took her by surprise, and deep down she could not understand why this information caused such a strong reaction in her. Finally, after a long journey through majestic corridors, they reached the central hall, which was striking in its grandeur. High ceilings decorated with elegant stucco, red walls shimmering in the light with golden patterns, and luxurious chandeliers. At parting, Aaron, wanting to strengthen the warm relationship, asked with a smile if this did not mean that they would now see each other more often, since the maid was now responsible for the care of her chambers, and perhaps would be able to pay more attention to her in everyday affairs. The maid, hearing such an unexpected question, visibly tensed up and lowered her gaze, because if the manager found out that she was behaving so casually with the mistress, without due respect and strict observance of hierarchy, then he would certainly not leave it unpunished. Aaron, understanding the girl's hesitation, smiled slightly, but there was a slight sadness in that smile, because she really sincerely hoped to get closer to the maid. But the difference in status was too great an obstacle for simple human communication. Having resolutely collected her thoughts and driving away unnecessary worries, the lady turned towards the central hall, allowing herself one last look at its luxury, and then firmly decided that the time had finally come to begin the magical ritual of purification. Energy flowed in her hands, intertwining with the streams of running water, which, obeying the will of their mistress, rushed forward, wrapping the space around them as if alive, and their sparkling waves filled the air with a special magical glow with each passing moment. From the depths of the magical whirlpool born of her spells, a water queen emerged, whose body was woven from flowing water, shimmering in the light like living crystal, and her bottomless eyes concealed unknown secrets of the depths. Erin, unable to contain her emotions, stepped forward with tears in her eyes, stretching out her hands to her old friend, asking with trepidation how she had lived all this time, because the memories of their days together flared up in her heart with renewed vigor, filling her with joy. However, the summoned spirit did not share her feelings. His transparent face was distorted in an angry expression, and, rising like a water storm, he furiously fell upon his former mistress, expressing the anger accumulated over long years of oblivion and amnesia. The Lady of the Waves was seething with indignation. Her voice like thunder sounded in the air, because she was only the second to be summoned, after the Fire King, which for her, a proud and wayward creature, seemed like an unthinkable insult that she could not leave unanswered. Erin, remembering for a moment how arrogant, stubborn, and jealous the Queen of the Waters was, suddenly felt not fear, but only touching nostalgia, and, not hiding her tears, smiled, because even after so much time, their meeting was still filled with the same rebellious fire. The Queen of the Water Element, crossing her arms over her chest, continued to grumble indignantly, indignant that she had not been summoned first, as if they had forgotten about her completely, and now she could not simply forgive her mistress for this unfortunate offense, because her pride was hurt. However, the noblewoman decided to act cunningly, realizing that persuasion and apologies would not help, and instead she began to shower the queen with compliments, saying how much she admired her beauty, nobility, and how happy she was to see her again after so many years of separation. Gently, with trepidation, the girl extended her hand and, barely touched the water spirit. Her touch was light, warm, and filled with sincerity, which made the Water Queen fall silent, soften, and finally, change her anger to mercy. The water element, dissolving its rage, moved forward and enveloped its mistress in soft streams of water, embracing her in cool but gentle embraces, because, despite the insult, she also greatly missed the one who had once been her only ally. They stood in the middle of the hall, enveloped in a soft glow of magic, and, like old friends who had not seen each other for many years, they hugged each other, forgetting about everything in the world, enjoying this long-awaited moment of meeting, filled with warmth, nostalgia, and sincere joy. Suddenly, with a dull sound, A massive artifact with a dragon's head was thrown to the floor, its magical energy completely extinguished, and the ancient product itself, having lost its power, collapsed like a lifeless shell, no longer capable of fulfilling its purpose. The noblewoman, exhausted from using magic, slowly sank to the cold floor, feeling her body losing the last bits of energy, her eyelids trembling from fatigue, and her vision swimming, because all her strength left her after the ritual, leaving only a heavy weakness. But suddenly, through the veil of fatigue, she noticed how, in the spacious hall, filled with the echo of footsteps, the young princess, breaking into a scream, begged the duke to stop, asking his forgiveness, and begging him to grant her an invitation to the ball so that she could come with the imperial family. The fortune teller turned out to be a truly rare beauty, with deep blue eyes, black hair, and a refined silhouette, dressed in an elegant yellow dress that emphasized her tenderness, making her look like a rare flower, fragile and refined. However, Elkanas, without even hiding his contempt, sharply and rudely responded that he felt only hatred for the family, accusing them of cowardice and deceit, reminding them how they time and again sent the princess away with her empty prophecies that were not destined to come true. In desperation, not wanting the man to leave again without an answer, the princess impulsively grabbed his hand, her voice trembling with emotion as she tried to convince him that this time everything was different, that she had come not at the behest of her family, but of her own sincere desire. Holding the man's hand in hers, the princess said with pride and determination that she had not come to him empty-handed, but with an important and new prophecy that she hoped would change his destiny and open a new path. The beauty, with a voice full of tenderness and a soft, reassuring smile, announced that a new prophecy had been revealed to her concerning the duke's late lover, and she hoped that it would bring him comfort, understanding, and perhaps a new outlook on the future. Arin, who had been secretly watching the young couple, overheard with interest that the new prediction was that the aristocrat would find happiness with a new man, and not with his deceased lover, as many might expect. The lady was about to leave when suddenly her spying was unexpectedly revealed. Elkanah suddenly raised his head and directed his gaze straight at her. His eyes sparkled with determination and some kind of inner strength, as if he knew about everything she was hiding, and his gaze was full of mystery. The noblewoman froze, unable to understand why the man was looking at her so intently and persistently. His gaze was piercing, as if he could read her thoughts, revealing everything she tried to hide and making her more vulnerable than ever. Without thinking, the beauty quickly sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees and hiding her head, as if trying to disappear, to hide from that gaze, from the power that emanated from the man, and from all the consequences that could follow this moment. Fear was clearly visible on her face, and in her yellow eyes there was a painful question. Would he now be angry with her for having so carelessly revealed her actions? And how would this affect the relationship, which she now feared as if on the threshold of something inevitable? After that, Arin, feeling anxiety growing inside, hurriedly ran towards the door, deciding to leave this place as soon as possible, because there was already anxiety in his heart that he could not ignore, and the desire to leave became stronger with every step. The lady, without looking back, quietly left the room. Her steps were light and quick, and her hair, fluttering, created the feeling as if she was simply disappearing into thin air, leaving behind only traces of mystery and unsolved feelings. Elkinas, still standing silently, raised his head up, his gaze directed into the distance, and he looked at the world around him, as if trying to understand what had just happened, and at the same time assessing the noblewoman who remained in his thoughts and in this strange moment. The maids, surprised by their mistress's quick departure, looked at each other, not knowing what to think, and then began to closely watch her unusual behavior when she walked with such a quick gait, while clutching her head as if something was bothering her. Night had fallen, and the east wing of the mansion was silent. It was huge and beautiful, with high windows that reflected the moonlight, creating an atmosphere of calm, but at the same time there was an underlying tension. The noblewoman decided to take an evening walk around the house, trying not to attract attention, and quietly moved along the walls, hoping that no one would notice her, because she wanted to be in silence and solitude, away from all the worries and anxieties. Opening the door to one of the rooms, she was surprised and shocked to see a man there who, like her, was not sleeping, and, noticing her, quietly greeted her, which made her instantly wary. But she decided to answer and not disturb the silence of the night. It was a maid who greeted the noblewoman politely with a smile. She was wearing a neat cap, a black dress, and an apron, everything as befits her position, and she looked quite calm, despite the incident that had happened the day before. Moreover, this maid was the same woman who had lost consciousness during the incident yesterday when she was attacked and fell to the floor, but now looked surprisingly calm and in good condition. Concerned, Aaron asked about the woman's well-being, worried that her condition might be worse than she thought, but she replied with a smile that she was fine and felt much better than before, assuring that the experience had left no traces on her. However, the noblewoman remained concerned about the maid's condition and couldn't help but ask if she had any ill effects after fainting, as she couldn't forget how much it had shaken her and was worried that the after-effects might have been hidden. After which the noblewoman, with relief and joy on her face, smiled broadly, gently taking the maid's hands in hers, and said that she was glad that everything was all right with her, because this was a real moment of relief that brought her peace and confidence that everything was not as bad as it seemed. The precious green stone, fashioned into a brooch, was given to the maid by her mistress as a special gift, symbolizing not only a sign of trust and care, but also as a communication device to be used between them if help was ever needed. The maid looked at the stone in delight, surprised by its beauty and value, because it was a truly expensive thing, and Aaron, standing next to her, only smiled, pleased that she was able to give such a valuable decoration. She had previously received this gem from her late father, who, despite his strictness, could not refuse his daughter's request, knowing how important it was for her to preserve this symbol of connection and memories, which was closely linked to their relationship. The baby, who was sleeping peacefully in his cradle, suddenly woke up, began to attract attention, smile, and joyfully scream so that all eyes were directed only at him. His little gestures always stirred the hearts of those around him. Aaron, feeling her heart fill with warmth from this sweet sight, quickly came up and took the boy in her arms, looking at him with love, because he was so sweet, smart, and full of life that her soul could not help but rejoice at this little miracle. The maid, covering her mouth with her hands in shock and joy, could not believe her eyes, watching how the mistress so easily picked up the baby in her arms and began to rock him, surprised by such unexpected tenderness and care. Aaron, smiling modestly, replied that she simply picked up the boy in her arms, because how difficult was it? She did not see anything unusual in this act, since for her it was a natural manifestation of love and care for the child. The maid, still perplexed, explained that no one had been able to lift the baby before, not even grown men, because he was stubborn and unyielding, which made him much more difficult for others, and only the Duke could handle him. Her face darkened, filled with gloom and bewilderment, as she realized that only the Duke was capable of lifting and rocking the boy. And now she was filled with questions about what was behind this unexpected and strange behavior. Aaron thought for a moment, and then asked the maid with interest if she was afraid of the boy and the Duke, because her reaction seemed strange and alarming, as if there was something more to it than just bewilderment. The maid hesitated, fearing her mistress's anger, and, unable to meet her gaze, quickly looked away, feeling how her secret was becoming clear, and excitement and fear were seizing her, as if something inevitable had opened up inside. Then she confessed her fear, closing her eyes, because it would be stupid to deny it, and it was becoming too obvious even to her, because fear filled her soul, and all her thoughts collapsed under the weight of this painful feeling. When she came to work here, she was forced to sign a magical contract that bound her to this unusual job, leaving only a shadow of freedom, and now her every step was under control, which was impossible to get rid of. The maid knelt before the noblewoman, begging for forgiveness, explaining that she was frightened by the fact that the baby never grew up, and, feeling the hopelessness of her situation, asked not to throw her out of the mansion, fearing that her life would be destroyed. Her hands shook in her lap, as the girl justified herself by saying that she was feeding her family and that without money, they would not be able to survive. Her voice trembled with despair, and the tears that appeared in her eyes only confirmed her hopelessness. Erin sat down next to the maid affectionately, calmly saying that she had no intention of sending her away and that everything would be fine. Her words sounded like comfort, filling the atmosphere with warmth and hope for the future. The maid sobbed, listening to the lady's words of comfort and support. Her heart filled with gratitude for such kindness, and tears rolled down her cheeks, because at that moment it seemed to her that the world around her began to gradually become brighter. A woman's hand gently twirled a lock of the maid's hair, caressing her tenderly, and this gentle gesture concealed such care that it seemed as if the whole world around became softer and all worries and experiences disappeared, leaving only a feeling of warmth and security. The young master was just a child, innocent and harmless, like a small creature that so needs love and warmth. Large eyes, full of naivety and curiosity, looked at the world, not realizing all its cruelty and difficulties, but still trying to understand it. The baby cried when he felt that he lacked attention. His cry sounded like a quiet but desperate call to those who could comfort and support him, and each of his cries was like an attempt to find his role in this big, uncomprehending world. When the maids looked at the boy with caution and fear, he felt completely alone. His little heart took this world full of bewilderment and ill will heavily, and every glance only increased his feeling of isolation. The baby sat in the cradle, surrounded by strangers, trying to protect himself from the strange nannies and from the hatred that seemed to come from those who were nearby. And in his little world, there was no place for evil, but it still penetrated, creating a barrier. The maid, her head down in confusion, imagined how lonely and scared their young master had been before, when he was surrounded only by cold and misunderstandings, deprived of the warmth and support that he so badly needed. The boy was handed from the hands of the noblewoman to the hands of the servant with such care, as if every gesture of his could destroy something, and the woman, feeling all the responsibility in this moment, accepted him as her most precious treasure. The woman carefully hugged the sleeping boy, her gentle arms wrapped around him, giving him a sense of security, and in her warmth he finally felt what he had been missing: care, attention, and love that should be natural. Tears of joy and gratitude welled up in the maid's eyes as she was able to hold the baby in her arms, and he finally did not resist her kindness. His small body relaxed, trusting the woman who brought him warmth. Arin clapped her hands joyfully, looking ahead, happily realizing that she had been able to lift the spirits of both the baby and the maid, because at that moment there was a feeling in her soul that she had done something good and necessary. At this time, Elkinus was already sitting in the noblewoman's dining room, propping his chin up with his hand. He was thoughtfully looking into the distance, immersed in his thoughts. It seemed that all his attention was focused on something important that was hidden from those around him. Finding himself alone, the man thought that the lady had been avoiding him all day, and his expression became thoughtful and a little gloomy until the aristocrat approached, trying to justify herself with a forced smile, hoping to dispel his doubts. The aristocrat was holding a boy in her arms, and she took him with her, feeling her heart fill not only with concern for him, but also with the desire to create an atmosphere of peace in which the baby could feel safe. Next to the table where the dessert stood, a variety of creams, strawberries, and other delicious treats, it seemed that everything was prepared to make this evening special, and each element of the table added to the atmosphere of lightness and sophistication. The sandwich-style appetizers were neatly displayed on a stand below, while the cakes and pastries proudly stood on top, creating an exquisite tablescape that was a joy to behold and a joy to taste. Erin, with an embarrassed mumble, admitted that she thought the sandwiches would be with eggs and cucumbers, but as it turned out, they were with ham and fresh lettuce, and this unexpected variety made her blush slightly. The noblewoman, blushing, put her hand behind her head and laughed, shyly admitting that she thought that all aristocrats ate such snacks, because that was her idea of high society. But the situation itself turned out to be a little funny. Elkinus was surprised to notice that the same description of dishes was in a book that one of his friends liked to read, and noticing this, he smiled slightly, realizing how even the simplest things can be part of strange stereotypes. The lady was sweating all over, trying to hide her lie, and said with despair that different things happen in life, because sometimes it is impossible to predict how even the most ordinary day will turn out, and her words sounded more like an excuse than the truth. Elkinas suddenly fell silent, covering his face with his hand, as if he was trying to hide tears, or on the contrary, hold back laughter. And in his thoughtful gaze, one could read such a mixture of emotions that Aaron could not understand what exactly he was feeling at that moment. Aaron asked him worriedly what was wrong with him, to which the man, waving his hand in her direction, replied that everything was fine, but his reaction remained strange and incomprehensible, as if he was experiencing something deeper than he wanted to show. The baby, sitting in the lady's arms, calmly watched what was happening, and at that moment, the noblewoman decided to change the subject, starting to talk about the Duke, hoping that this would distract everyone from Elkinas's strange silence and help return the conversation to its usual course. Hugging the baby with her arms, the noblewoman sincerely asked her interlocutor to move the boy to the main wing, to the far east, so that he could be with the others, because her concern for him was sincere, and she could not allow the baby to remain apart from everyone. The young man asked with interest why he had to move the young master's quarters to another place, his voice full of curiosity, as if he was trying to understand the intricacies of a situation that seemed rather strange to him. The maiden sitting next to him briefly replied that she had 3 reasons, and the aristocrat curiously asked her to voice them, since the desire to understand these reasons seemed to have become important and urgent for him. Decisively, but with a slight smile, the beauty stated that, firstly, it was for the boy's safety, since moving to another place could make it easier to protect him in case of danger, and these words sounded serious and convincing. The second reason, as the maiden said, was that a split had begun among the servants into 2 camps. Some considered the baby their master, while others called him the child of the dragon monster, and this division only complicated the situation. The noblewoman placed her hands under the boy's, listening thoughtfully to the silence, as if feeling responsible for his safety, and internally deciding what would be best for his future in this very dangerous world. She moved on to the third reason, saying sadly that there had been no reason to lock the baby up in the East Wing all alone in the first place, since he was kind and his only problem was the isolation, which deprived him of the attention he needed. The little boy, despite his kindness, continued to remain in the shadows, ignored by everyone and abandoned in a dark room where nothing could protect him from loneliness and from the feeling of abandonment, which grew stronger every day. Sitting at the table with the noblemen, the lady tried to convince him that they absolutely had to show those around them that the boy, despite all the rumors, did not pose any threat, because only in this way could further misunderstandings be avoided. Otherwise, she said, at this rate, bad rumors would start to circulate about the young master, and everyone would consider him a monster, which, of course, could lead to even more problems for the baby, about whom everyone knew so little. The young man had previously believed that leaving the baby under the angry gaze of bad people was extremely dangerous, and so he took him under his protection, trying to protect him from all those threats and prejudices that could arise. The lady did not know what to answer the man when he reminded her that she herself had come here earlier with her father to kill the boy. And these words hurt her deeply, leaving a certain mark in her soul that she could not immediately justify. The poor child was completely innocent, but everyone was afraid of him only because he hatched from a dragon egg and did not grow up, remaining a small child, which only exacerbated all the fears and rumors surrounding his essence. The irritated lady jumped up from her seat, slapping her hand on the table, as if trying to bring herself to her senses, and, at the same time, express all her determination and urgency in this matter, which could not remain without attention. Holding the boy close to her in her arms, the noblewoman declared that from now on she would love him, protect him, and take care of him, despite all the dangers and fears that could surround him, and this was her decision, which she did not intend to change. The gentleman listened to her silently, but reminded her that the main problem of fear of the boy would not be solved by words alone, and in order to change the opinions of others, one must act, and not just promise. The boy was born from a cursed dragon egg, which caused many rumors and fears surrounding his existence, causing people to look at him as something sinister and dangerous, not realizing that in reality he is just a defenseless child. Aaron admitted that this was indeed the case, but she was sure that such truth could be refuted by declaring that all these scary stories were just fiction and rumors that had no real basis. They thought long and hard and came to a common decision that in order to dispel all fears and misunderstandings, they should make a false announcement in which they would state that the boy was not really the child of a monster. The man winced at the noblewoman's words when she suggested that he too should give the boy his love, just like his father's, and a sudden realization flashed in his eyes that perhaps this was exactly what he was missing. The man was the only one in the past who had ever held a child in his arms and cared for him, despite all the preconceived notions, not fearing that this child was born from a cursed dragon egg and could be perceived as a danger. After this, the man took up a sword and stood up to protect the baby, believing that he, despite his essence, did not deserve fear and hatred, and he needed to be protected, no matter how his presence in this world was condemned. Aaron smiled kindly and quietly added that the Duke himself actually wanted to take care of the boy and love him as his own son. And her words sounded with warmth and confidence, as if she knew for sure that it would bring peace to everyone's hearts. Elkanus turned away from her words, not wanting to acknowledge this truth because it could change his perception of the situation, and he was not ready to accept it fully, fearing that it would change his attitude towards himself. After which he added that the girl, like her father Zephyr, had one thing in common: the habit of getting into other people's souls without any questions or permission, interfering in their personal affairs, disregarding boundaries, and ignoring other people's experiences. The lady smiled reservedly, saying that the Duke was now obliged to show love to the baby and to take care of him, despite his unusual origin, because only in this way could he be freed from fear and prejudice. But when the young man did not answer, she felt very uneasy, almost burst into tears, afraid that she might have gone too far, and that she had demanded too much from the handsome man, that she might have been too persistent. Closing her eyes in fear, the noblewoman quickly said that she might have said something unnecessary and that she had absolutely no bad intentions, did not want to offend anyone, hoping that her words did not cause a negative reaction. But Elkanus interrupted her, unexpectedly saying that he would fulfill all her suggestions and that from now on the baby would live in the main hall, where he would be more comfortable and safer, and all fears and misunderstandings should leave him. The young man slyly looked away, saying that he could find other ways to achieve his goal, hinting at alternative paths, which calmed the lady down a little, but she still remained worried that the Duke could not get rid of the thought of her resurrection. This calmed the lady down a little, but she was still upset, as she felt that the Duke's thoughts about her resurrection did not leave him, and she could not shake the feeling that everything that was happening was too difficult for her. Suddenly, the man extended his hand towards the beauty, demanding that she come closer to him. His gesture was so confident and powerful that it contained a certain power that attracted her attention and made her step forward, unable to resist his attraction. The young man gently took the baby in his arms, smiled, and noticed that the boy looked content. His expression was calm and peaceful, as if he felt cared for and safe in the arms of this man. Aaron laughed softly, because the Duke with the child in his arms looked like a young father, carefully hugging his baby. This image was so harmonious that she could not hold back a smile, feeling lightness in her soul. After eating, the noblewoman headed into the forest, absorbed in her own thoughts. Her steps were quiet, and her heart was full of doubts, because she knew that her path lay in the place where a summoning ritual associated with fanatics and dark magic was once carried out. Her long hair fluttered in the wind, as if dancing to the rhythm of nature, giving her image lightness and grace, and her gaze was focused on the path, calling out to the mysteries hidden in this forest, where every tree and stone kept its secrets. Traces of black magic hung in the air, and dark sensations of magic, like a thick fog, enveloped her, causing growing anxiety, as if magic itself was watching her every step, watching her movements, and waiting for her decision. The beauty furrowed her brow. Her face took on an expression of determination, and then, with a barely noticeable but confident smile, She froze in front of the dark, mysterious forest, as if ready to cleanse it of any threat or secret that lurked within. It was strange, because the demonic energy could be easily destroyed by the Duke's sword. But despite this, its traces still remained on the road, as if invisible streams of energy continued to float in the air. The lady thought, placing her hand on her chin, her gaze becoming serious and focused. Could it be that there was some other spell placed on top of the curse, increasing its influence and complicating the situation even more? One of the hallmarks of black magic was the lure, as if invisible skeletal hands, gliding through the shadows, reached out from dark corners, suspiciously rising up, as if ready to seize something or someone who dared to pass by. This evil magic, which possessed a powerful dark force, consisted of two parts, each of which performed its own unique role. The first part was a transmitter, which, like an invisible thread, directed dark energy to its target. The second part of this magic was a hand that served as a receiver, accepting all the directed force, absorbing it and strengthening it, like a vessel ready not only to hold, but also to redirect the energy in the right direction. If magic had been applied to the first part, it would have worked on the second as well, provided that it was no more than 3 miles away, as if an invisible link between them allowed the dark power to be transferred from one element to the other. Aaron walked further through the forest, confidently feeling every step, because she knew that the curse could be easily removed by destroying either the receiver or the transmitter. But there was one but that made her stay alert and not rush into a decision. The bait could be absolutely anything that would seem ordinary at first glance: a tree, a bird, or a stone. It could hide in the most unexpected forms, and finding it was incredibly difficult, like finding a needle in a haystack, because everything was carefully hidden. The lady raised her hand in the air with determination, her gaze full of confidence, because for her there were no impossible tasks, and she was ready to perform the purification ritual, despite any difficulties that fate could throw at her. The spirit of the earth rose from the dark depths, slowly rising as if submitting to the will of the sorceress, and respectfully greeted her, as if the ancient force of nature itself responded to her call, ready to assist in this important and decisive ritual. The noblewoman threw herself into the arms of the queen of all living things with lively delight, her arms involuntarily wrapping around trees and plants, as if nature itself were greeting its patroness with incredible warmth, affection, and respect. The lady was sincerely glad to see her old friend, the one who once had the power to rule the earth, and in her eyes one could read not only joy, but also gratitude, because their connection remained strong and warm despite the years. After all, she was the main one among all the elements, the mother of all living things, personifying the life force of nature, and was always in excellent relations with the sorceress, who was entrusted with something important and irreplaceable in this world. Remembering that it was not yet time to rest, Aaron resolutely placed her hands on her old acquaintance's shoulders and, with noticeable anxiety in her voice, asked if she had any objections to signing a contract with her again, as had been the case before. When silence followed, the girl could not bear it any longer, and tears began to flow down her cheeks, and an inescapable pain could be heard in her voice when she asked with longing why she suddenly turned out to be against their union, which had previously been so natural. The mother of all living things, gently touching her chest with her hand, looked at her calmly and said that she would be only too glad to make a contract again. But now she had one condition that she could not ignore. Gently, the spirit took strands of the maiden's hair in his fingers, lovingly and regretfully, remembering the day when the aristocrat left this world, leaving behind a void that could not be filled and a pain that would not subside. Kissing her mistress's hair, the mother of plants quietly asked the lady to be more careful with her body, to value it as a fragile and valuable thing, to avoid excessive risks, because now she must protect her life as the greatest treasure. Erin couldn't hold back her tears when she heard how much her friend's heart ached after the death of the one who was gone forever, and how hard it was to bear the bottomless melancholy that remained in her soul, tormenting her every day. The woman's hands tenderly reached out to the spirit's face, as if wishing to console him in this eternal grief, trying to ease his suffering, as if nature itself were trying to soften the pain left after a great loss. The noblewoman began to gently stroke the cheeks of the Queen of Plants, assuring her that from now on she would not give the slightest reason for worry and upset, promising to take care of and protect her no matter how much the world demanded it. The spirit of the earth, hearing the sincerity of her words, gradually calmed down and, feeling trust, decided to open up to the lady, feeling that now the moment had come to entrust her with his strength and help in the search. Believing that she was truly worthy of it, the two began searching for the bait that was linked to the demon's dark energy that remained on the road, harboring danger hidden in its tracks, and deciding that they needed to find it as soon as possible to eliminate the threat before it gained power. Thoughtfully, the spirit of all living things said that their weakness was distance. The fanatics could not establish sufficient influence over such a distance, and this elusive barrier became their main vulnerable spot, which they could not overcome. The spoken spell filled the air, and Mother Nature addressed her subjects, plants and animals, after which the wind blew at her words, as if nature itself responded to her call, ready to act in response to the call. After some time, Arin, feeling the tension in the air, turned to the spirit, asking what she was able to learn from her subjects and what important information they were able to convey for their further actions and plans. The moon hung high in the night sky, and it was said that a few days ago many stones had been thrown into this place, which now lay there as silent evidence of the mysterious event that had left its mark on this place. Mother Nature, with a slight wave of her hand, awakened the magical power, and the stones, as if by magic, began to rise from the ground, as if nature itself was responding to her call, ready to fulfill her every wish. The girl noticed one of the stones that had risen up that stood out. It was strange, emitting red demonic energy, and the moment she saw it, her instincts told her that it was a source of danger. The girl's hand gripped the stone with determination, and using the magic seal, she immediately activated the spell to destroy the bait and rid this place of the dark power that lurked within it. The lady was interrupted by her friend, who controlled nature, who, pointing her finger to the side, explained with confident determination that it was from that place that the ominous dark energy emanated, which the earth itself felt as if it were resisting this threat. She pointed her hand in that direction. Her nails were covered in deep black varnish, and her long and graceful fingers seemed like a piece of nature itself, which could command the elements, creating an atmosphere of danger around. A strange object was torn out of the ground, wrapped in many ancient seals and strong ropes. It seemed not just trash, but something filled with magical power, harboring dark intentions and sinister energy, ready to break out. After the object was thrown with force to the ground, the ladies, stunned by what they had just discovered, froze in place in horror as they looked at the object, which contained unimaginable horror and ancient powers that caused fear and despair. The noblewoman recoiled in horror as her gaze fell upon what they had discovered: a cursed doll, covered in mysterious markings and exuding an ominous aura, as if the very darkness and evil power was contained within this soulless object. The lady, feeling the danger of this object, asked her friend to immediately destroy the strange thing, and she herself, without thinking, took the coin and the talisman that were tied to the doll, suspecting that they could be the key to the solution. Looking at the strange red seal left on the doll, she firmly stated that perhaps, thanks to these mysterious signs, they would be able to track down the culprit, whoever it was, and stop his dangerous actions. The noblewoman walked through the forest, lost in thought, trying to figure out why the fanatics had come to this abandoned corner of the world, for what purpose they had caused such harm, and whether they really wanted to harm the Duke's son using this cursed power. The noblewomen, who stood to the side, enthusiastically discussed the latest trends in the world of fashion, exchanging many opinions and recommendations, closely following new trends and selecting the most stylish and relevant images. Among the other girls, one stood out with her long black hair, which flowed smoothly over her shoulders, and a lush ball gown that emphasized her refined grace, and she was the princess of the empire, as if she had stepped out of a painting. Eugelian de Denbane looked ahead with blue eyes that reflected emptiness. Her gaze was impassive, and she held a fan in her hands, while her face remained motionless and devoid of any emotion. The sorceress froze in place right in front of the princess, not daring to make the slightest movement, as if afraid to disturb this moment, because she understood how important it was to behave correctly in such a situation, and it was unwise to rush. Her face flushed brightly, for the fortune teller was truly incredibly beautiful. Her exquisite appearance was so refined that she resembled a rare flower that had blossomed at dawn, attracting admiring glances. Despite her stunning appearance, the clothes she wore seemed quite uncomfortable and slightly awkward to move in, which contrasted with her aristocratic appearance, as if she had been raised in the strictest traditions of noble society. One of the noblewomen, unable to bear the sorceress's display of ignorance, looked at her angrily, upset by her failure to live up to high standards, and, unable to restrain herself, ordered that all rules of etiquette be observed in the presence of the princess. Erin froze in surprise, not knowing even the most basic rules of decency, not understanding how to behave in the company of other nobles, and feeling that her uncertainty and inexperience were becoming more and more obvious in such an unfamiliar environment. She attempted a curtsy with complete awkwardness, but almost lost her balance, making her movements look awkward and embarrassed, as if she was trying to hide her confusion, which only added to the tension in her situation. The second lady, with a blue cap, angrily covered her face with a fan and shouted sharply that the girl had no manners at all, was rude and ill-mannered. Her behavior left much to be desired and did not meet the requirements of high society. Smiling awkwardly, Erin tried to justify herself by saying that she had not yet had time to learn all the rules of manners, but she would try to master all these subtleties as soon as possible so as not to leave a bad impression and not disappoint others. The noblewomen were outraged by Erin's response, with the exception of the princess herself, who, folding her fan with a majestic gesture, sternly stated that they themselves were to blame for the current situation, and not her, thereby putting everyone in their place. The fortune teller haughtily, with a challenge in her voice, declared that such a commoner as the sorceress hardly had the opportunity to learn to behave with dignity, and her words sounded like a mockery, full of contempt and arrogance. Erin froze, her face frozen in shock and embarrassment. Feelings of shame and awkwardness overwhelmed her, as the other ladies laughed loudly at her clumsy attempts to conform to the norms and rules of high society. But instead of bursting into tears, the sorceress's face suddenly filled with determination and enthusiasm. A fire lit up her eyes, and she felt an extraordinary inner strength, ready to withstand ridicule and prove her worth. She took the princess's words as sincere advice, and thanking her for such a sensible remark, bowed respectfully, thinking that this was an act of true nobility on her part, which made her heart fill with gratitude. Suddenly, to her surprise, the girl felt a strange movement in her bag, and before she could even realize what was happening, she realized that it was her talisman. The maid was urgently calling her, and the situation seemed much more serious than she could have imagined. The lady's lips pressed together sharply, her eyes widening in surprise and alarm as she realized the importance of what was happening right now, and realized that her presence on the scene was not what she should be doing at such a moment. Right in the middle of the conversation, the sorceress, unable to restrain herself, rushed away, disrupting the entire ceremony and outraging the noblewomen, because she had much more important and urgent matters than continuing this tiresome conversation, and her spirit was striving for another goal. The beauty, with a light and playful smile, said that she would be the first to leave today, and with this elegant gesture, she said goodbye to the rest of the ladies, leaving behind a shadow of mystery and a slight enigma that immediately attracted all eyes. The mood of the noble ladies immediately worsened, their faces became more tense, and they all involuntarily fell silent, feeling how the tension in the air increased sharply, because such unpredictability clearly knocked them out of their usual rut. Seeing the maid passing by, one of the ladies, unable to restrain her curiosity, immediately asked if she knew the strange lady who had run away, and the maid, suppressing a smile, replied that yes, it was the duke's son's nurse, but added nothing more. The princess stood with a straight back, as if an invisible weight had covered her, and at that moment it seemed to her that the rumors that the aristocrat was hiding his child were true. Her face became cold, and her eyes filled with alienation and stern determination. An icy glint appeared in her gaze as she held back her anger, and ordered all the noblewomen to remain silent, demanding that they stop spreading rumors about the Duke so as to prevent further gossip that could damage her reputation and status. The noblewoman, with obvious curiosity in her voice, asked the maid where the strange girl was headed, and the maid, without losing her composure, replied that she was currently living in the aristocrat's house, leaving this information as something obvious. Gossip began to flare up again among the ladies, and there was talk in the air that Elkinus seemed to have brought a new nanny into his home for his son, which could not help but give rise to additional rumors and questions regarding his personal life. Meanwhile, away from everyone, Arin stood with the maid she had summoned, and they quietly discussed the child, her gaze focused and her thoughts determined to learn more that could shed light on the important events and secrets hidden behind the walls of this house. It turned out that the boy had grown up as if by several years in a very short time, and now he could already speak, calling her his mother, which was a complete surprise and shock for Erin, because such rapid maturation seemed impossible. Erin, wide-eyed and shocked, froze when she heard the baby calling her Mommy, because it seemed like so little time had passed since she first saw him, and so quickly he changed, leaving her bewildered. When the girl, trying to express her tenderness, wanted to pick up the baby in her arms, he resolutely began to resist, and, with an obvious desire to show his independence, stood up on his little legs and walked on his own, as if asserting his adulthood and readiness to act independently. Awkwardly, with difficulty, the boy moved his little legs, almost falling, learning to take his first steps. His face expressed concentration and determination, as if each step was an important achievement on the path to independence. After that, he smiled widely at his new mother, his eyes filled with genuine joy and anticipation, as if he was looking for her approval, wanting to hear praise for being able to take another step in this huge and unknown world for him. The girls happily watched his clumsy attempts, his small successes, and praised him with sincere delight, supporting and rejoicing in his progress, because every step was like a small victory for this amazing little one. When Elkinus appeared and, with warmth and care, took the boy in his arms, he, without holding back his feelings, began to call the man Daddy, happily and with complete confidence, as if in his heart there was no longer any doubt who was now his protector and support. The little boy, with a naive and touching childish babble, muttered the words he had always wanted to confess to his father, how much he loved him, and his sincerity was so pure and carefree, as if this moment was the most important in his little life. Despite the simplicity of the words, suddenly the aristocrat, feeling the girl's gaze on him, turned to her, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment, because his son, playfully, pulled him in different directions, almost forcing him to look less stern and majestic than usual, adding lightness. The man, with slight concern and genuine interest, directed his gaze at the girl and asked if she by any chance knew why the boy began to grow so rapidly, since this had never happened before, and confusion and doubt were visible in his eyes. The girl raised her hand, her fingers moved smoothly in the air, calling on magic and energy, like an invisible force, began to gather around her, filling the space around with a mysterious and powerful atmosphere, ready to show its power. Using the power of the wind, she carefully covered the boy's ears, because he was still a child and too young for such conversations that could frighten him or affect his perception of what was happening, creating unnecessary anxiety. The noblewoman explained that today she had cleared the place of a curse, which could have caused the child's rapid growth, since such magical influences often affect physical condition and development. She remembered finding baits hidden in rocks, left by someone in the forest where demonic energy was hovering, and now everything became clear. It was this force that cursed the place, creating a dangerous atmosphere that threatened all living things around. The devilish doll was hidden in the ground, carefully buried and sealed with ropes and talismans, as if it contained within itself an ominous power, ready to manifest itself only the moment someone dared to disturb its peace. With a frown on her face and a firmness in her voice, the beauty stated that the curse was the reason why the child's growth was limited, preventing him from developing and growing, and only now that it was lifted, the baby could finally start growing. The dragon child found itself cursed and sealed in chains, as if a dark force was enveloping him, holding back his power and preventing him from developing to his full potential until the moment came when the curse was broken and freedom was possible again. The father, holding his son tightly in his arms, looked at him with an icy gaze full of hatred, and, turning to the lady, asked in a poisonous tone if she wanted to say that all this time there was someone in the shadows who was preventing the baby from growing and developing, leaving him in constant danger. The beauty felt a slight doubt, but, listening to her thoughts, she realized that this was probably true, and that an enemy was waiting for them ahead, hiding in the shadows, ready to interfere with the fate of this child, disturbing their peace. The boy settled comfortably on his parent's chest, quietly becoming silent, and at that moment the latter quietly expressed gratitude to the interlocutor for her help, feeling a deep relief, as if a heavy burden had finally been lifted from his shoulders. The lady frowned, but her gaze remained unwavering, full of determination, and without hesitation, she firmly replied that she was simply doing her job, not expecting gratitude, but merely following her duty and the inevitable, predestined path. But the young man, with a light laugh, interrupted his companion, declaring that all this merit belongs exclusively to her, because she really showed herself to be a real fine fellow, having coped with a difficult situation, which aroused deep respect in his soul. With the same gentle and bright smile that the noblewoman had on her face many years ago, almost a whole century ago, an old friend looked at her, the one who had once been nearby and had not lost his mind, despite everything that was happening around. The lady, meeting her gaze with unfailing warmth, responded with a smile, feeling her own smile remain as bright and sincere as ever, and her heart filled with a quiet, invisible happiness from the mutual respect and kindness they shared. Suddenly, the young boy, overcome with panic, screamed loudly, angrily demanding that the spirit leave his ears immediately, since he could no longer hear a sound, and there was a desperate urgency in his voice, as if he was ready to fight an invisible threat. The sorceress froze, shocked, because her spirits obeyed the boy's request, and, without delay, left him, which surprised her to the depths of her soul, because she did not expect that a child was able to influence such powerful beings. The noblewoman frowned, shocked that her magic, which she considered an undeniable power, was dispelled by a mere child, and a worry crept into her mind. Something was clearly wrong with this boy. The little boy was confused, noticing that his mother was upset, and with sadness in his voice, he asked sadly if he had done something wrong. His little heart sank with doubts, because he only wanted to do everything right for his beloved parents. Tears welled up in his eyes, as the man quietly said that he just really wanted to hear his parents' voices again, because that moment was so important to him, and he didn't know what else he could do to bring back that joy. The girl sat down next to the baby, trying to comfort and encourage him, saying softly that, despite his young age, he was already showing amazing powers in witchcraft, which in itself was extremely impressive and unusual for a child of his age. She folded her hands around her face and added with pride and tenderness in her eyes that he was a real little genius, with such amazing abilities that clearly surpassed those of most of his peers, and this inspired her with admiration. The baby looked curiously into his mother's face, listened to her words, and sometimes asked with interest what certain words meant, because his world was just beginning to open up, filled with many new concepts and amazing discoveries. When he heard that he looked a lot like his dad, his face lit up with joy and his eyes sparkled with delight, because for him this was an important and wonderful revelation that gave him confidence and happiness. While the two of them were talking, the Duke stood nearby, his gaze intense and attentive, watching their every word and movement, not trying to interfere, but feeling that every moment had special meaning for him. Erin was sitting on the couch, and next to her on the floor, intently turning the pages, sat a boy, absorbed in a book, his attention completely occupied by reading, as if this world was much more important to him than everything else. The noblewoman, with her arms folded across her chest, thoughtfully pondered how to dispel all those harmful rumors about their baby that threatened to spread among the other nobles, because she understood perfectly well how important their family's reputation was. The maids immediately noticed the mistress as soon as she approached them and spoke. Her gaze was insistent, and her words were full of seriousness, which made them wary and pay attention to her every gesture, realizing that something important was about to happen. The servants were filled with unspeakable anger and deep horror when they learned the terrible truth about their little master, who could not grow and develop normally due to dark conspiracies and sinister intentions emanating from insidious villains. The noblewoman was completely shocked by how easily the servants believed this truth, which sounded so incredible and strange that even she herself found it difficult to comprehend the seriousness of what was happening, because it destroyed her previous ideas about reality. The silver-haired maid awkwardly admitted that she had believed the untrue rumors herself before, and the shame was evident in her voice as she said it, realizing how wrong she had been and how foolishly she had judged an innocent child. The little boy, born from a dragon's egg, was nicknamed the Monster due to his unusual nature, and with each new rumor, he became the object of more and more fear and misunderstanding among people who could not accept his uniqueness. Aaron froze in bewilderment when she was told that in the first days of his life, the baby ate metal and iron, which seemed incredible but was true, and she felt how the world around her was losing its familiar outlines. The lady could not believe this gossip and stood in complete bewilderment as to how others could believe such nonsense about the Duke, because these rumors seemed to her so absurd and untrue that they only caused irritation and bewilderment. The truth was that the boy's mother had given birth to him when her husband, leaving her alone, went off to another woman, leaving her alone, which left an indelible mark on the child's fate, growing up without support and love. After his mother's death, Elkinas was left alone with a nanny, locked in a village where no one cared for him or protected him, which added to the loneliness and suffering he had to deal with throughout his life. Tired, Aaron sank down on the sofa, her body burdened with the weight of thoughts, and at that moment she plunged into deep thought, trying to comprehend everything that had happened and understand how she could help the baby change his destiny in this world full of difficulties. Raising her hand to her face, she realized that having dealt with the false rumors about the aristocrat's son, it was now time to deal with the same rumors that were spreading about the Duke himself and decide how to proceed with this new threat. Aaron agreed to accept the maid's help in preparing dinner, realizing that every moment was important and that restoring order and asserting the truth required her efforts, especially in this turbulent time when every decision could change the course of events. Evening came, and the mansion was swallowed by silence, broken only by the light rustle of the wind outside the windows, creating an atmosphere of anticipation in which one could feel both calm and invisible tension, as before an important event, ready to happen at any moment. Erin donned a new white dress and blue gloves, and her look was so delicate and sophisticated that it seemed she had become the embodiment of a forget-me-not who had come to a new reception, radiating elegance and grace that could not go unnoticed. In the dining room, at the large table, the men were already waiting impatiently for her: Elkinas, her husband, and Zephyr, her adoptive father, who, noticing her appearance, rose from his seat and addressing her in a loud and warm voice, expressed his joy and deep respect for her presence. The noblewoman paused a little awkwardly at the door, feeling that the time had finally come to try out everything she had learned from books on proper techniques, and, making a slight curtsy, she tried to perform it as gracefully as possible, although her heart was beating a little faster than usual. Moreover, she felt deeply confused when suddenly 2 outstretched hands appeared in front of her, and she, not knowing which one to choose, stood there, doubting and trying to understand which of these 2 men was worthy of her attention, because each of them was in their place. The men standing before her held out their palms, awaiting her decision, and each of them hoped that she would choose her, because both were aristocrats, possessing not only high birth, but also outstanding beauty, which made their choice especially difficult. The sweet lady standing in front of them awkwardly stared at the 2 outstretched hands. A look of bewilderment appeared on her face, because the choice was really difficult, and she could not immediately determine which of them was worthy of her attention and big heart. Her adoptive father's hand, clad in a white glove, rested gently on her shoulder, as if supporting and guiding her in this moment of uncertainty, reminding her that she was not alone and could always count on his support and wise advice. The Duke's ungloved hand lay beside hers, bare and elegant, a symbol of his willingness to give her a choice, while his gaze was full of tense anticipation, and he scarcely concealed his impatience, sensing the approach of the important moment. Deciding to follow strict etiquette and show respect for tradition, the lady carefully took the hand that was wearing the elf's glove, and with this gesture, she not only emphasized her manners, but also showed her determination. Smiling at the Duke, she put into that look not only calmness, but also confidence, as if gently reminding him that his concerns were in vain, since she already knew her place in this important choice perfectly well and was ready for the next step. The girl carefully sat down to the left of the Duke, realizing the importance of observing tradition, because there had to be an empty seat on the right, intended for the Duke's future wife, and, following strict etiquette, she did not dare to violate the unspoken norm, so as not to cause unnecessary conversations. Suddenly, the silence in the room was broken by a loud, piercing cry that announced the arrival of the Princess of the Empire, and everyone present immediately felt the tension and anticipation of something important appear in the air. The beauty walked into the room. Her makeup was flawless, with bright red lips, and her black hair, carefully styled in a stylish updo, perfectly complemented her look as she smiled, radiating incredible beauty and attracting the attention of everyone around her. With a calm and confident step, the princess moved straight towards the table. Her movements were smooth and elegant. She slowly held the hem of her yellow dress, as if enjoying the moment, slowly and maintaining her dignity. Arin, sitting in the shadows, could not understand what was happening and anxiously wondered why the lady had appeared all alone, without her usual accompaniment, as if deliberately violating all established norms and traditions, which added anxiety to her perception of the situation. Julian de Danbane quietly, with a caustic and malicious smile, hid her satisfaction, enjoying the sight of the sorceress's distorted face, perfectly aware of how her sudden appearance could cause a wave of unrest and radically change the course of events. Zephyr, realizing that he should have been more attentive and helped his daughter, immediately headed to the table, placing his hand on his heart, as if apologizing for his slowness and promising that everything would be settled with due respect and care. The man, elegantly bowing before the lady who had arrived, like a true count, offered to accompany her to the table to demonstrate his courtesy, as well as his readiness to provide all the necessary support and attention. The lady, putting her hand to her face, quietly uttered words that expressed her calm and confidence, that now, thanks to his actions, she could be sure of the reputation of his family without worrying about further consequences. She then glanced casually at the seated lady, as if to hint at her obvious lack of manners and etiquette, emphasizing that, in her opinion, the girl did not deserve such attention or respect.